At dawn on June 6, 1944, the gates of history swung open as the largest invasion ever launched crashed against Hitler's fortress Europe. Along the windswept beaches of Normandy, France, the largest amphibious invasion in human history was about to unfold. Operation Overlord, better known as D-Day, was not just another battle. It was the opening of a second front, the bold gamble that sought to break Hitler's grip on Western Europe and bring the war one step closer to its end. The skies thundered with Allied aircraft, the seas churned with thousands of ships, and on the horizon, young men braced themselves for a fight that would decide the fate of a continent. But this story is more than just soldiers storming beaches under fire. It is about the months of planning, deception, and sacrifice that made the invasion possible. From the quiet halls where Eisenhower wrestled with impossible decisions, to the intelligence war that fed the Germans false information about the invasion's location, every detail mattered. It was a moment of unity. American, British, Canadian, Free French, and countless others standing together in one of history's most daring operations. And when the landings began, the courage of ordinary men turned into extraordinary feats of endurance, defiance, and sacrifice. The beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, each told their own story. Some saw surprising success with fewer casualties. Others, like Omaha, became a blood-soaked crucible of fire where men advanced inch by inch under relentless machine gun fire. Above them, paratroopers and glider troops had already descended into the night skies, landing behind enemy lines to seize bridges, cut communications, and sow chaos. The sea, the land, and the air all converged into a single defining clash of wills. Operation Overlord was not guaranteed to succeed. A storm almost forced its delay. German defenses, the Atlantic Wall, stretched for miles. Failure would have meant catastrophe. Another Dunkirk, another disaster, and possibly years added to the war. But success meant liberation, the beginning of the end for Hitler's empire in the West. By the end of that day, though the cost was staggering, the Allies had secured a foothold in France, and from that moment the tide of the war could never be reversed. This documentary will guide you through every moment of the invasion, from the secret plans, the training, and the deception operations, to the brutal landings and the push inland. We'll explore the stories of soldiers and civilians alike, the strategies that worked, the sacrifices that were made, and the legacy of courage that D-Day left behind. So join us as we relive the entire Operation Overlord, the largest invasion in history, and the turning point that set Europe free. And before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. We love seeing our worldwide community come together to remember this day of sacrifice, courage, and liberation. By 1943, the map of Europe was still painted in the colors of Hitler's empire, stretching from the shores of Brittany to the gates of Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht had suffered staggering losses in the Soviet Union, yet the Reich remained a fortress in the West. Across the English Channel, Britain stood defiant but exhausted after 4 years of unrelenting war. America had joined the fight after Pearl Harbor, and its vast industrial power was now flowing into the Atlantic like an unstoppable tide. The Soviets, bleeding millions of lives on the Eastern Front, demanded a second front to ease their desperate burden. Stalin pressed Roosevelt and Churchill relentlessly, warning that without relief, the Red Army might collapse or make peace with Germany. The Allies agreed in principle, but execution was another matter entirely. The English Channel, only a narrow stretch of water on the map, represented a formidable natural barrier. German divisions, bunkered behind mines, obstacles, and concrete, waited for any sign of a cross-channel attack. And so the question haunted Allied planners in London and Washington: where would the blow be struck? The demand for a Western Front was not merely political, but a matter of survival for millions. By 1943, the Soviets had endured the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, but their casualties were beyond imagination. Stalin wanted an invasion in France that would draw German divisions away from the east, giving his armies breathing room. For Churchill, the decision carried both opportunity and dread. The British remembered the horrors of the First World War, when waves of young men fell in futile assaults against fortified lines. A premature invasion of France, he feared, could end in disaster and strengthen Hitler's grip. Yet Roosevelt, driven by his generals, saw no other path to end the war quickly. The Americans argued that only a full-scale invasion could crush Nazi Germany's military machine. A second front was not only a promise to Stalin, but a pledge to liberate Western Europe from occupation. Thus, the road to invasion was set not by choice, but by necessity, dictated by the relentless arithmetic of war. Selecting the landing site was a question of strategy, geography, and deception. The most obvious choice was Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel, where Britain and France were separated by only 21 miles. Calais offered the shortest crossing time, the easiest supply route, and the most direct path into Germany's industrial heartland. But the very obviousness of the target made it dangerous. German intelligence, like the Allies, saw Calais as the logical invasion point, and Hitler had heavily fortified the region. Artillery batteries, concrete bunkers, and armored reserves stood waiting behind the beaches. Normandy, further west, lacked Calais' advantages, yet it offered surprise. Its beaches were broad, tidal, and less heavily defended, with fewer armored divisions nearby. The gamble lay in choosing between strength and cunning, between a direct thrust and a deceptive strike. That gamble would define the largest seaborne invasion in history. The German defenses along the coast were already formidable by 1943, and they grew stronger with every passing month. Under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Atlantic Wall became more than a propaganda phrase. Mines, steel obstacles, and anti-tank ditches were laid across the sand. Concrete bunkers housed machine guns and artillery pieces, designed to sweep the beaches with fire. Entire villages along the coast were emptied to make way for strongpoints and killing zones. At Calais, Rommel concentrated his heaviest weapons, including massive guns capable of striking the English coast itself. Normandy was defended too, but less heavily, with fewer armored divisions stationed nearby. Rommel believed the first hours of an invasion would decide everything. If the Allies gained a foothold, the Reich might never push them back. Thus he worked tirelessly to harden the defences, convinced that the blow would fall at Calais. His certainty would prove both logical and fatal. Behind the planning tables, personalities shaped the decisions as much as maps and intelligence. Winston Churchill favored Mediterranean campaigns, striking at Germany's soft underbelly through Italy and the Balkans. Franklin Roosevelt, listening to his generals George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower, pushed for a direct assault on France. Stalin grew increasingly impatient, viewing Allied delays as betrayal, and his pressure could not be ignored. Eisenhower himself emerged as the man who would eventually bear the crushing responsibility. Calm, steady, and diplomatic, he managed the tensions between British caution and American urgency. Montgomery, the British Field Marshal, argued forcefully for overwhelming force at the beaches. His insistence would later shape the scale of the landing. Personal rivalries, national interests, and the sheer weight of logistics collided in every meeting. Yet all agreed on one point: Europe could not be freed without risking everything on a single throw of the dice. The choice of Normandy came after endless deliberations, calculations, and wargames. Its beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, offered wide landing zones and access to inland roads. The Cotentin Peninsula provided a chance to seize a port at Cherbourg, critical for resupply. The rolling Bocage countryside, though difficult, offered concealment from German counterattacks. Normandy was far enough from Britain to avoid constant Luftwaffe strikes, yet close enough for air support. German defences were present, but thinner compared to Calais, making surprise possible. Most importantly, the Allies could reinforce faster than the Germans if the beaches were secured. Operation Overlord, as it was named, was not just an invasion, but the beginning of a liberation campaign. Every detail, from tides and moonlight to German rail timetables, was scrutinized by planners. Normandy was not the easy choice, but it was the right one. By the summer of 1943, the Allies had cleared North Africa and were advancing through Sicily and Italy. Yet these victories, though important, did not bring Germany to its knees. The Wehrmacht still occupied most of Europe, feeding on its resources and manpower. The Soviets pressed forward in the east, but they demanded relief with mounting urgency. Churchill and Roosevelt knew that only a landing in France could deliver the decisive blow. The lessons of Dieppe in 1942, where a Canadian raid ended in disaster, weighed heavily on their minds. That failure had shown how costly a direct assault could be, yet it also provided valuable lessons in planning. The coming invasion would require not thousands but millions of men, supported by fleets and air power on a scale never before seen. Every soldier knew that the Channel crossing would be the most dangerous journey of their lives, and every general knew that failure would be catastrophic, perhaps prolonging the war for years. Thus, by late 1943, the die was cast, even if the moment was still months away. Operation Overlord became the centerpiece of Allied strategy, dwarfing every other theater of war. Factories in America and Britain churned out landing craft, tanks, and gliders by the thousands. Millions of tons of supplies were stockpiled in southern England, while entire counties became military staging grounds. Across the Channel, the Germans watched nervously, unsure where the blow would land. Hitler, obsessed with Calais, refused to shift reserves to Normandy, blinded by deception. Eisenhower and his staff knew the risks, but they also knew the opportunity. A successful landing would open the door to France, then to Germany itself, and finally to the heart of the Reich. The world waited, caught in the tense silence before the storm, and in that silence, the fate of Europe hung by a thread. The war had created unlikely partners, men who came from different worlds yet were bound by necessity. Winston Churchill, steeped in the traditions of empire, carried the memories of Gallipoli and the Great War with him like shadows. Franklin Roosevelt, pragmatic and calculating, guided America with a mixture of charm and iron resolve, hiding his failing health behind an aura of confidence. Joseph Stalin, ruthless and suspicious, had already sacrificed millions in the furnace of the Eastern Front, and he viewed the Western Allies through eyes narrowed by blood and mistrust. Together, these three men held the fate of the free world in their hands. Yet their unity was far from natural. It was hammered out on the anvil of war, tempered by both desperation and ambition. Each came to the table with demands that reflected not only military need, but also political visions for the post-war world. Churchill sought to preserve Britain's global influence. Roosevelt dreamed of shaping a new international order, and Stalin demanded survival above all. Their alliance was as fragile as glass, yet as powerful as steel when pointed at the heart of Hitler's empire. And in late 1943, That alliance would be tested like never before. The Tehran Conference, held in the Iranian capital between November 28th and December 1st, 1943, became the crucible where the future of the war was decided. The city buzzed with spies, soldiers, and secret police, its narrow streets crawling with agents from every major power. Stalin, who had never left the Soviet Union during the war, journeyed thousands of miles to meet his allies face to face. His presence was a statement of power, a reminder that the Red Army bore the heaviest burden of the conflict. Roosevelt, despite his illness, traveled under great secrecy, arriving with his advisors determined to cement American leadership. Churchill, older and weary, carried with him maps, proposals, and a determination to influence every decision. The setting itself was tense. Tehran lay within reach of German agents, and Allied intelligence uncovered plots to assassinate the leaders. Security was suffocating, with Soviet NKVD patrols guarding every street corner. Inside the walls of the Soviet embassy, history was about to be rewritten. Stalin's demands were clear, blunt, and delivered with unflinching confidence. The Red Army had lost over 6 million men since 1941, and the Soviet Union bled with every passing day. He demanded a second front in Western Europe no later than the spring of 1944. Anything less, he warned, would be betrayal. For Stalin, promises were meaningless unless backed by hard action, and he pressed Roosevelt and Churchill relentlessly. He distrusted their motives, suspecting that the West preferred to let the Soviets and Germans bleed each other dry. His words carried the weight of desperation, but also the cold edge of calculation. He knew his armies had gained the initiative after Kursk, yet he understood the Reich still held enormous strength. Stalin wanted proof that his allies would fight alongside him, not merely watch from across the Channel, and at Tehran he would not leave until that promise was in writing. Churchill, meanwhile, maneuvered with the instincts of a veteran statesman. He spoke eloquently of Mediterranean campaigns, of striking through the Balkans and protecting Britain's imperial lifelines. He argued that securing Italy and Greece would outflank Germany and contain Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. His words were not merely strategic, they were political, aimed at preserving Britain's status in a world where America and the Soviet Union were ascendant. But his arguments found little sympathy in Stalin, who saw them as stalling tactics. Roosevelt, too, remained unconvinced, wary that Churchill's vision would drag the Allies into secondary theatres. Though Churchill carried the prestige of a nation that had stood alone in 1940, his voice carried less weight in terror than it once had in London. He fought for relevance against the gravitational pull of American and Soviet power. His cigar smoke filled the conference rooms, but the decisions were drifting beyond his reach, and by the end he would reluctantly bow to the will of his partners. Roosevelt approached Tehran with a mixture of idealism and political shrewdness. Unlike Churchill, he spoke less of empire and more of liberation, framing the war as a struggle for democracy's survival. His focus was Normandy, and he pressed the point with quiet determination. He believed that America's vast resources and manpower could make the invasion succeed where others had failed. Roosevelt also used Tehran to build a personal bridge to Stalin, bypassing Churchill when convenient. He played the role of mediator, smiling, listening, and making promises that carried the weight of American industry behind them. At the same time, he envisioned a post-war world where the United States would not retreat into isolation but lead a new international order. Tehran was as much about shaping the peace as it was about waging the war. Every handshake, every dinner conversation was calculated to strengthen trust. And in Stalin, Roosevelt found a partner he believed could be managed, even as suspicion lingered in the air. Beyond strategy, the atmosphere of Tehran revealed the raw tension of the alliance. The leaders dined together, toasted victories, and posed for photographs, yet mistrust never fully vanished. Stalin's blunt remarks often cut the air like knives, delivered without charm or diplomacy. Churchill bristled at slights, but masked his irritation behind wit and eloquence. Roosevelt, confined to his wheelchair, maneuvered with words rather than gestures, shaping the flow of conversation with a subtle hand. Behind the scenes, aides and generals wrestled with logistics. How many landing craft? How much air cover? How to coordinate the greatest armada in history? Each decision was a mosaic piece, in a picture none of them could yet see fully. Outside the conference walls, soldiers on every front continued to bleed and die, their fates tied to choices made in quiet rooms. The Tehran conference was a performance, but its consequences were deadly real, and in those rooms, the war's climax began to take shape. It was here, in Tehran, that Operation Overlord was not only discussed but confirmed. Stalin extracted the promise he wanted: the Western Allies would launch the invasion of northern France in May 1944. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed, binding themselves to a course from which there was no turning back. The decision electrified the conference, setting in motion the largest military operation the world had ever seen. To Stalin, it was vindication, proof that his allies would finally shoulder their share of the burden. To Roosevelt, it was the necessary step toward victory, one that would cement America's role as the decisive force in the war. To Churchill, it was a concession, one he accepted with reluctance but also with grim resolve. Maps of Normandy now lay at the heart of Allied planning, overshadowing every other theatre. And with the ink of Tehran, the countdown to D-Day truly began. Yet the alliance forged at Tehran was one of necessity, not trust. Each leader left the conference with his own vision of victory, and his own fears of what would follow. Stalin eyed Eastern Europe, determined to secure Soviet influence over the nations his armies would liberate. Roosevelt imagined a world where the United States and the Soviet Union could coexist under a new framework of global cooperation. Churchill feared both outcomes, worrying that Britain would emerge victorious but diminished, caught between two giants. The unity of the Big Three was as much a performance for the cameras as it was a reality on the ground. But for that moment in late 1943, they had agreed on the greatest gamble of the war. Operation Overlord was no longer a plan. It was a promise. The stage was set, the actors were chosen, and the script of history was already in motion. And in the months that followed, the beaches of Normandy would transform promises into fire, steel, and sacrifice. Before the invasion could even be attempted, the Allies faced a truth as old as warfare itself. Surprise was the key to survival. If the Germans guessed the landing site, they could concentrate their forces and annihilate the assault before it gained a foothold. Hitler had more than 50 divisions stationed in France, many of them armored, ready to be unleashed at the point of attack. Normandy offered opportunity, but it also carried the risk of failure if the enemy was forewarned. Thus was born Operation Bodyguard, a vast deception plan unlike anything ever attempted in modern war. Its goal was to stretch German defenses thin, confuse their commanders, and fix their gaze on the wrong place at the wrong time. The operation was not one plan but many layered across Europe in an intricate web of lies. Every signal, every dummy tank, every whispered rumor became part of the performance. The stakes were colossal. The lives of hundreds of thousands depended on whether the Germans took the bait, and so deception became the first weapon of D-Day. At the heart of Bodyguard was Operation Fortitude, itself divided into two brilliant subplots, North and South. Fortitude North suggested an Allied invasion of Norway, forcing Hitler to station nearly 400,000 troops in Scandinavia. Fortitude South, the more crucial piece, aimed directly at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the channel, and the most logical target for invasion. The Allies built an entire phantom army, the first US Army Group, commanded on paper by the brash and aggressive General George S. Patton. Patton's reputation as a relentless battlefield commander made the deception believable. Even the Germans expected him to lead the charge. Inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and fake landing craft lined the fields of southeastern England, visible to German reconnaissance planes. Radio operators transmitted endless streams of false orders, chatter, and coordinates, creating the illusion of an army preparing for battle. Photographs taken by the Luftwaffe confirmed to German intelligence what they already believed: Calais was the true target. And thus fiction began to masquerade as fact. The brilliance of fortitude was not in its spectacle, but in its subtlety. Every fake signal was woven into genuine traffic, every phantom unit mixed with fragments of truth. The Germans intercepted messages that spoke of divisions massing, of logistics moving toward Dover, of plans coordinated with the Royal Navy. They saw dummy landing craft bobbing in the harbours, counted vehicles parked in fields, and heard orders transmitted across the airwaves. Each detail reinforced the next, creating a tapestry too convincing to ignore. The Allies even arranged for double agents to corroborate the illusion. These men and women, code-named with quiet anonymity, fed Berlin a steady diet of lies. Among them was the famous agent Garbo, whose fabricated network of informants made him one of the most successful deceivers in history. The genius of the plan was that no single piece looked extraordinary on its own, but together they painted a picture so real that even Hitler could not look away. Patton himself played a role in selling the illusion, though sidelined from real command after controversies in Sicily. He visited troops, appeared in public, and allowed the German spies who followed his every move to believe he was preparing for battle. His name carried weight, and his mere presence in the southeast of England was as powerful as a fleet of tanks. German analysts tracked his movements carefully, convinced that such a commander would never be wasted on a diversion. In truth, Patton's army was a mirage, rows of canvas tanks, plywood artillery, and aircraft that would collapse in a stiff wind. Soldiers assigned to the deception joked as they inflated rubber Shermans and parked them in neat rows. At night, floodlights illuminated dummy airfields, with fake aircraft taxiing into positions they could never fly from. The performance was flawless, convincing even to Allied soldiers who stumbled across it. For the Germans, watching through the narrow lens of reconnaissance and reports, it was undeniable evidence, and so Calais remained the obsession. The deception extended beyond the English coast into occupied Europe itself. Resistance networks planted rumours in French villages, whispering of Allied contacts near Calais. Double agents within Spain and neutral Sweden passed on carefully crafted information that confirmed the same story. Even diplomatic channels, subtly manipulated, echoed with hints of a northern strike. The Germans believed what they wanted to believe, that the Allies would cross at the shortest point, the place where logic seemed to demand it. Hitler, guided by his rigid instincts, had long considered Calais the obvious choice. His generals warned of Normandy, but their voices were drowned out by the weight of false intelligence. The deception was a symphony, and every instrument played in perfect harmony. From wooden tanks to whispered lies, the performance was relentless. And each day that German divisions remained anchored to Calais, the Allies bought more time. Time in war is the most precious currency of all. But deception is never risk-free, and every falsehood carried the danger of discovery. If a Luftwaffe pilot had swooped too low, he might have seen through the canvas skins of the dummy tanks. If a German agent had resisted double-crossing and remained loyal, the entire facade might have crumbled. Yet fortune favored the Allies, and German intelligence proved remarkably gullible. Years of Allied code-breaking had left the Abwehr, the German intelligence service, riddled with mistrust and incompetence. Many of their best agents in Britain had been turned into double agents long ago, their loyalties reversed with quiet precision. Garbo alone fabricated over 20 sub-agents, none of whom existed outside his imagination, yet Berlin believed every word. The result was not merely deception, but manipulation, where the Germans became complicit in their own blindness. In war, victory often belongs not to the strongest, but to the cleverest, and in 1944, cleverness became the Allies' greatest weapon. By spring of 1944, the deception reached its crescendo. German command expected an invasion, but every signal pointed them to Calais. Hitler ordered the 15th Army to remain there, guarding the beaches and fields, waiting for an attack that never came. Even when the first reports of landings in Normandy arrived, he hesitated, convinced they were a feint. Days after June 6th, armoured divisions still sat idle near Calais, bound by the illusion that Bodyguard had crafted. This hesitation gave the Allies the precious hours they needed to expand their beachheads. Without it, the panzers might have rolled to the coast and driven the invaders into the sea. Instead, the deception held firm, its tendrils binding even the Führer himself. Bodyguard did not just prepare the invasion, it shielded it in its most vulnerable hours, and in those hours, history tilted. Operation Bodyguard remains one of the greatest feats of deception in military history. It was a campaign fought not with bullets or shells, but with whispers, shadows, and illusions. It turned the English countryside into a stage, and soldiers into actors in a play for the enemy's eyes. It demonstrated that wars are not won by strength alone, but by imagination, patience, and daring. The phantom armies of fortitude never fired a shot, yet they saved thousands of lives by holding German divisions in the wrong place. The double agents who played their parts carried secrets heavier than rifles, their lies more lethal than bombs. Even Patton, sidelined from the real invasion, contributed by becoming the general of a ghost army. The brilliance of Bodyguard was that it was not a trick played once, but a story told over months, woven so tightly it became indistinguishable from truth. When the Allies stormed Normandy, they did so under the cover of a lie, so vast it reshaped the battlefield. And in the end, deception became as decisive as the invasion itself. In the winter of 1943, as the plans for Operation Overlord took shape, the Allies faced a critical question: who would command the greatest invasion in history? The choice was not simply about rank or seniority, but about finding a leader who could unify armies from different nations, cultures, and doctrines. The British pressed for their own generals, men like Brooke or Montgomery, while some Americans favored George Marshall, Roosevelt's trusted chief of staff. Marshall, however, was indispensable in Washington, where he guided the entire war effort and advised the president directly. Into this vacuum stepped Dwight D. Eisenhower, a general who, until a few years earlier, had never commanded troops in battle. His rise was meteoric, propelled by his skill in planning, diplomacy, and organization. Eisenhower had already proven his worth coordinating the North African campaign and the invasion of Sicily. He was not flamboyant like Patton, nor did he carry Montgomery's reputation for battlefield mastery. But what Eisenhower possessed was perhaps rarer than brilliance, an unshakable steadiness, and an ability to make others work together. And in a coalition strained by ego and rivalry, that quality mattered above all. Eisenhower's leadership style was deceptively simple, yet profoundly effective. He was approachable, informal, and quick to smile, qualities that masked the iron beneath his calm exterior. He listened patiently, allowing subordinates and allies alike to voice their opinions before steering the discussion toward consensus. His gift was not to impose his will, but to make others feel invested in the decisions that were made. Soldiers admired him because he spoke their language, often visiting camps and speaking with enlisted men directly. Politicians trusted him because he never sought glory for himself, but always spoke in the name of unity. He rarely raised his voice, yet when he made a decision, it was final, and no one mistook his kindness for weakness. Eisenhower believed that morale was as important as strategy, that men fought better when they trusted their commander. His strength was not in being the smartest man in the room, but in drawing the best out of those around him. And as Supreme Commander, this gift became the cornerstone of victory. The burden on Eisenhower's shoulders in 1944 was almost unimaginable. He was tasked with coordinating over 2 million men from the United States, Britain, Canada, and the Free European forces. His command stretched across naval fleets, air armadas, and entire armies, each with its own culture, traditions, and rivalries. The logistics alone were staggering. Millions of tons of supplies, thousands of vehicles, and fleets of landing craft had to be marshaled and delivered with precision. Every miscalculation risked catastrophe on a scale the world had never seen. Eisenhower knew that a failed invasion would not just be a military setback, it could prolong the war for years, or even lose it entirely. The pressure of history bore down on him, yet outwardly he never wavered. Behind closed doors, however, he confided to friends that the weight was crushing. In his pocket, he carried a draft statement accepting full responsibility if the invasion failed, and with that piece of paper, he prepared to shoulder the consequences of history alone. His headquarters in southern England became the nerve center of the greatest gamble of the war. Maps stretched across walls, covered in arrows and symbols, marking divisions, airfields, and convoy routes. Commanders from different nations crowded into smoky rooms, their tempers often flaring as strategies clashed. Montgomery demanded overwhelming force and argued endlessly over details, while Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory questioned the use of paratroopers, fearing massive losses. Admiral Ramsey worried about naval logistics, while General Bradley pushed for greater American initiative. Eisenhower sat at the head of these stormy councils, absorbing the friction and guiding it toward resolution. He rarely revealed frustration, instead calming disputes with measured words and unshakable patience. To outsiders, the meetings seemed chaotic, but Eisenhower's quiet authority held them together. He understood that no plan survived the first day of battle, but unity had to survive everything, and in that understanding lay the true art of command. On the eve of D-Day, Eisenhower's calm exterior concealed a storm of doubt and responsibility. The weather was uncertain, with gales sweeping the channel and cloud cover threatening the air assault. Meteorologists warned of rough seas and poor visibility, conditions that could scatter landing craft and paratroopers alike. The invasion had already been delayed once, and every delay risked discovery. His commanders urged caution, but time was running out, and the men were already embarked on their ships. Eisenhower walked among them, speaking to paratroopers of the 101st Airborne as they prepared to board their planes. He told them that the eyes of the world were upon them, and their courage would bring liberty to Europe. They cheered him, smiling and laughing, though many would never return. Eisenhower later admitted that he could barely speak, knowing how many would die within hours. Yet in that moment, he gave them the strength they needed, even as his own heart was heavy. His decision to launch the invasion on June 6th was perhaps the most consequential choice of the war. At 4:15 a.m. on June 5th, after a tense meeting with his weather advisors, Eisenhower gave the order. "Okay, let's go," he said simply, words that unleashed the storm of history. It was not said with fanfare, nor with speeches, but with quiet resolve, as though he were signing a simple order. In reality, he had just committed 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 men to the greatest gamble in military history. The magnitude of that choice could not be overstated. Everything depended on its success. If the landings failed, the political consequences would be catastrophic, both for the war and for his own nation's faith in leadership. Yet Eisenhower did not hesitate, for he knew hesitation was fatal in command. His strength was not in certainty, but in the courage to act despite uncertainty, and with that courage, the invasion was set in motion. Eisenhower's gamble was not just military, it was human. He knew every division number concealed faces, names, and lives that would soon be offered on the altar of war. He spent the night of June 5th, restless, pacing and smoking, waiting for the first reports to arrive. In his private notes, he confessed that he prayed not for himself, but for the men whose lives depended on his decisions. He carried the weight of knowing that thousands would die because of his order, yet perhaps millions would live because of its success. When the first reports of landings came in, his staff watched him closely for reaction. He remained calm, asking questions, analyzing details, never betraying the turmoil within. But later, in the solitude of his quarters, he would admit that the responsibility had aged him in a single night. The gamble was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in fire and blood on the beaches of Normandy, and Eisenhower, for all his composure, felt the cost with every report that crossed his desk. In the end, Eisenhower's gamble was vindicated. Though the price was steep, the landings succeeded, the beachheads held, and the Western Front was reborn. The world hailed the triumph, but few understood the weight of the man who had made it possible. Eisenhower never boasted, never claimed the credit, but always pointed to the soldiers who fought and died. He emerged from the war not as a conqueror, but as a leader who had borne history's heaviest burden with humility. His genius was not in battlefield brilliance, but in the rare ability to unite men and nations toward a common purpose. That quality had carried the Allies through the storm of D-Day, and it would carry him later into the presidency of the United States. For now, though, in June of 1944, he was simply the supreme commander, the man who had rolled the dice and won. Yet even in victory, he carried in his pocket the note of failure, a reminder of how close the abyss had been. And that quiet piece of paper remains one of the most haunting relics of the war. By the spring of 1944, southern England had transformed into an armed camp, the likes of which the island had never seen. Quiet villages and rolling farmlands disappeared beneath endless rows of tents, vehicles, and barracks. American GIs mingled with British Tommies, Canadian infantry drilled alongside Free French and Polish units, and soldiers from Norway, the Netherlands, and Czechoslovakia wore their flags with pride. More than 2.8 million Allied troops gathered on the island, a staggering concentration of manpower aimed at one goal, the liberation of Europe. Roads once meant for horse carts now thundered with the weight of Sherman tanks and half-tracks. Fields that had grown wheat for centuries were filled with artillery, stacked in rows like a forest of steel. Airfields hummed with the roar of engines as fleets of C-47 transport planes and Spitfires took to the skies. Every port was choked with ships, from mighty battleships to humble landing craft. For civilians, life carried on under rationing, but their towns pulsed with the energy of war, and in every corner of the South, the invasion force swelled like a storm waiting to break. The soldiers who gathered in England came from every walk of life and every corner of the Allied world. The Americans brought their swagger and abundance, with pockets full of chewing gum and cigarettes that became instant currency. The British brought their experience, hardened by years of desert campaigns and raids across Europe. Canadians arrived with quiet determination, proud to fight as equal partners in the liberation of France. French units trained with a fire born of exile, desperate to reclaim their homeland. Polish soldiers carried bitterness and resolve, knowing their country was still chained under Nazi rule. Even smaller nations like Norway, Belgium, and Czechoslovakia sent contingents who saw this invasion as their path to redemption. For many soldiers, it was their first glimpse of foreign comrades, a crash course in accents, slang, and traditions. The camps buzzed with exchanges of stories, jokes, and songs, binding strangers into a common cause. This army was not just vast, it was truly international, a coalition forged in war. Training for the invasion was relentless, designed to prepare men for a kind of battle no one had ever fought on such a scale. Amphibious drills took place on the English coasts, where soldiers learned to clamber down rope ladders into landing craft and wade ashore under simulated fire. Live ammunition crackled overhead, mines were detonated on practice beaches, and barbed wire obstacles were strung across the sand. Engineers tested demolition charges against steel obstacles, refining the techniques that would be needed on D-Day. Paratroopers practiced night jumps again and again, their bodies bruised and battered from endless landings in dark fields. Naval crews rehearsed the choreography of launching thousands of landing craft into the surf. Pilots drilled in precision bombing and strafing runs, synchronizing with ground commanders in exercises that mimicked the coming battle. Even medical teams trained for mass casualties, setting up field hospitals in barns and churches. Every day, the lessons of failure at Dieppe in 1942 echoed in the minds of commanders, and every drill was another step closer to turning chaos into coordination. The sheer scale of the build-up strained England's resources and reshaped its landscapes. Roads crumbled under the weight of tanks, forcing engineers to lay down new surfaces overnight. Entire forests were cut down to make room for supply depots filled with crates of ammunition, fuel, and rations. Railways ran day and night, carrying trains loaded with jeeps, artillery, and men to staging areas near the Channel. In ports like Portsmouth, Southampton, and Plymouth, harbours were clogged with ships so tightly packed they seemed to form floating cities. Warehouses overflowed with stockpiles, from canned rations to spare propellers for aircraft. Airfields sprouted like mushrooms, dotting the countryside with runways, hangars, and control towers. Local civilians adjusted to the influx, their quiet lanes now filled with convoys stretching for miles. Children gawked at tanks rolling past their schools, while pubs brimmed with soldiers, speaking in a dozen languages. Even the countryside bore scars of preparation, with barbed wire and anti-aircraft guns on once idyllic hillsides. England itself became the launching pad of liberation, its very soil transformed into a weapon of war. Behind the assembly of men and machines lay an army of planners and logisticians, who worked with mathematical precision. They calculated every gallon of fuel needed, every crate of rations consumed, and every bullet that would be fired. In total, more than 7 million tons of supplies were stockpiled in Britain by the time the invasion began. Each soldier required careful preparation, uniforms tailored, weapons tested, and equipment packed into bundles that had to be carried across beaches. The naval fleet alone demanded staggering resources, with 6,939 vessels ranging from small landing craft to mighty battleships. Air support required millions of gallons of aviation fuel, stored in vast underground reservoirs. Engineers designed floating mulberry harbors to create artificial ports on the beaches of Normandy. Pipelines were laid under the channel Operation Pluto to pump fuel directly into France after the landings. The invasion was not just a military plan, it was a logistical miracle on a scale the world had never seen. And Eisenhower knew that without this foundation, no amount of bravery could secure victory. Yet behind the statistics and machinery were men who carried their own private fears and hopes. Young Americans from Kansas and New York found themselves eating rations beside Canadians from Toronto or British miners from Wales. Many had never traveled farther than their hometown before boarding ships to Europe. Letters from home were treasured like gold, tucked into helmets and breast pockets, as reminders of what they were fighting for. Soldiers carved names into the stocks of their rifles, scrawled graffiti on barracks walls, and played cards late into the night to pass the time. Training was brutal, but the waiting was often worse, as men grew restless under the weight of anticipation. Some wrote diaries filled with quiet dread, wondering if they would live to see another week. Others embraced the moment with bravado, masking fear with jokes and songs. For every soldier, the countdown to D-Day was deeply personal, a march not just toward battle, but toward destiny. And the camps of southern England echoed with the heartbeat of millions preparing for the greatest gamble of their lives. Among them were paratroopers, the men chosen to leap into darkness hours before the first landings. The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions drilled relentlessly, practicing night jumps, assembling in chaos, and fighting with minimal support. They carried heavier burdens than most, each man loaded with weapons, ammunition, and gear that made their parachutes barely manageable. British 6th Airborne troops prepared to seize bridges, rivers, and crossroads that would be vital to halting German counterattacks. Glider pilots rehearsed the dangerous art of landing fragile aircraft in fields, often at night, without engines or second chances. These men knew their odds were slim, yet they embraced their role with fierce pride. They were the Spearhead, the first to step onto French soil, and the ones most likely to be surrounded. Many painted symbols on their helmets, from cards to dice, as talismans against the unknown. For them, training was not preparation but rehearsal for sacrifice, and their courage would be tested before dawn on June 6th. As the spring of 1944 turned to summer, the Great Army in England reached its peak of readiness. Over 150,000 men stood poised for the first wave, with hundreds of thousands more waiting to follow in the days ahead. Their equipment was checked, their routes plotted, and their objectives etched into maps folded into their packs. Convoys of trucks carried them toward ports, while landing craft bobbed in harbors like horses straining at the reins. From the air, southern England seemed alive, a patchwork of camouflaged fields, tented camps, and airstrips stretching to the horizon. The build-up could not be hidden, but thanks to deception, the Germans never guessed its true destination. Soldiers looked across the channel at the grey outline of France, knowing that soon they would cross it in fire and steel. Civilians watched them march through towns and villages, cheering, waving, and praying for their return. The island pulsed with anticipation, every heartbeat counting down to the storm. And as June approached, the armies of liberation stood ready to hurl themselves into history. Every great invasion depends not only on the courage of men, but on the tools that carry them into battle. For Operation Overlord, the Allies created an arsenal so vast, so varied, that it defied the imagination of even seasoned soldiers. Central to this armada were the landing craft, humble yet indispensable, the vessels that would carry infantry, tanks, and supplies onto hostile shores. The most famous of these was the Higgins boat, officially designated the LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle, and personnel. Designed by American boat builder Andrew Higgins, it was a marvel of simplicity, with a shallow draft that allowed it to run aground on beaches. Its distinctive ramp dropped like a jaw, spilling out soldiers into the surf under enemy fire. Eisenhower himself later declared that Higgins had won the war, for without his craft no invasion could have succeeded. Alongside the LCVP were larger landing ships, LCIs for infantry, LSTs for tanks, each designed for a specific role in the ballet of amphibious assault. Thousands of these vessels filled Britain's harbours, lined up like arrows in a quiver, and when the invasion came, they would become the bridge between the sea and the shore. The sheer number of landing craft required was staggering, and their production became a race against time. American shipyards churned out Higgins boats by the thousands, with workers laboring day and night in assembly line fashion. Steel was cut, engines installed, and hulls riveted together in a matter of days. Women welders, part of the Rosie the Riveter workforce, contributed as much as men, their sparks lighting up the factories that fed the war effort. In Britain, shipyards focused on larger landing ships, capable of carrying tanks, trucks, and artillery. The LST landing ship tank could swallow an armoured column and deposit it directly onto the beach. These ungainly giants were slow and vulnerable, yet without them, armoured support would never reach the front. Each craft was tested, modified, and perfected through endless drills on the English coast. By June 1944, the Allies had assembled over 4,000 landing craft of every type, enough to move an army across the Channel. It was a fleet built not for beauty, but for utility, designed to turn sea into battlefield. Yet landing craft alone could not solve the problem of sustaining an invasion across beaches. Ports were the lifeline of any army, and in Normandy, the Germans had fortified every harbour, from Cherbourg to Le Havre. Without a port, the Allies risked starving their armies of supplies within weeks. The solution was audacious, bordering on the impossible: build artificial harbours and tow them across the Channel. These were the Mulberry harbours, engineering marvels that would rival the pyramids in ambition. Massive concrete caissons called phoenixes were constructed in British shipyards, each the size of a small fortress. Tugboats dragged them into place, where they were sunk to form breakwaters. Floating roadways, nicknamed whales, stretched from the harbours to the beaches, carrying trucks and tanks ashore. Entire piers rose from the sea, transforming open beaches into bustling ports. It was logistics as grand theatre, a feat no army had ever attempted before. Operation Overlord was not just about getting men ashore, it was about keeping them there, fed, armed, and reinforced. The planners calculated that 20,000 tons of supplies would be needed every day once the beachheads were established. Ammunition, fuel, rations, and medical supplies had to flow continuously, or the invasion would collapse. To achieve this, every truck was preloaded in England with precise cargo, marked and assigned to its destination beach. Engineers laid down miles of steel track on the sand, turning beaches into temporary highways. Fuel pipelines, part of Operation Pluto, pipelines under the ocean, were prepared to pump gasoline directly into France. Thousands of jeeps, half-tracks, and artillery pieces were staged in perfect order, ready to roll off landing craft the moment ramps dropped. Even the humble bulldozer became a weapon, clearing wreckage and building roads within minutes of landings. Logistics officers spoke of their task in terms of rhythm, a flow that had to remain unbroken no matter the chaos, and in that rhythm lay the heartbeat of the invasion. Air superiority became the shield under which this logistical miracle could unfold. By June 1944, the Allies had amassed nearly 12,000 aircraft dedicated to Overlord, ranging from fighters to heavy bombers. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, had been ground down by years of attrition and fuel shortages. German planes were scarce, their pilots inexperienced, and their airfields bombed into ruins. Over the beaches of Normandy, Allied fighters would fly thousands of sorties a day, strafing German convoys and guarding the skies. Bomber groups hammered rail lines, bridges and communication centers deep in France, isolating the battlefield. Transport planes waited to carry paratroopers and supplies, ready to flood the skies on the night of the invasion. For every soldier who would land, there were dozens of pilots overhead, ensuring they would not be slaughtered by German aircraft. Air power did not win battles alone, but without it, no beachhead could survive. And in Normandy, it became the unseen wall of steel above the sea. The naval fleet assembled for Overlord was equally unmatched in history. Nearly 7,000 vessels gathered, ranging from mighty battleships and cruisers to minesweepers and tugboats. Their role was not only to carry men, but to dominate the seas and pound German defenses into rubble. Battleships like HMS Rodney and USS Texas prepared their 14-inch guns, capable of hurling shells the weight of cars onto coastal bunkers. Cruisers and destroyers would sail close to shore, providing fire support as soldiers advanced inland. Minesweepers worked tirelessly, clearing deadly fields of explosives from the channel. Even merchant ships, converted and armed, joined the Armada, their civilian crews now part of the war machine. The sight of this fleet stretched across the horizon would itself be a weapon, a psychological blow to German defenders. For the men aboard, the sea became both ally and enemy, a pathway to liberation and a grave for many. The Navy's role was not glamorous, but it was indispensable, and in June 1944, it became the steel backbone of Overlord. For the soldiers preparing to board these ships, the arsenal of liberation was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. They saw endless rows of landing craft, their ramps clattering as crews rehearsed again and again. They heard the thunder of artillery fired in practice, the whine of aircraft engines as fighters roared overhead. In briefings, they were shown models of beaches detailed down to hedgerows and farmhouses, each marked with objectives. They watched films of how to exit Higgins boats, how to survive underwater if swamped, how to crawl under fire. For many, the sheer scale of the machinery reminded them of their own fragility. They were small figures against a backdrop of steel, engines and guns that seemed to stretch beyond comprehension. Yet, in the machinery, they found confidence, believing that such a force could not be stopped. The arsenal was more than tools, it was reassurance. And that reassurance steadied hearts on the eve of the unknown. Operation Overlord was not simply a battle. It was a logistical symphony, a choreography of machines, ships, and men moving in unison. Every Higgins boat launched was a note in that symphony, every Mulberry Harbour a crescendo, every airstrike a drumbeat overhead. Without these elements, courage would have been squandered on empty beaches, and sacrifice would have meant nothing. The planners knew it, the generals knew it, and the soldiers knew it as they boarded their craft. This was not just the arsenal of liberation, it was the very lifeline of victory. The beaches of Normandy would be drenched in fire and blood, but behind them lay an unbroken chain of supply that stretched across the sea. The miracle of Overlord was not that the Allies landed, but that they endured and expanded, fed by this unrelenting tide. In war, battles are often remembered for their heroics, but they are won in warehouses, factories, and shipyards. The men who fought on D-Day carried rifles, but behind them stood millions who built the tools of liberation. And together, they forged the arsenal that would crack open Hitler's fortress. For Adolf Hitler, the Atlantic Wall was more than a defensive line. It was a symbol of Nazi invincibility, a concrete fortress stretching from Norway to the Spanish frontier. The regime boasted that it was impregnable, a wall of steel and stone that would smash any Allied invasion before it touched the sand. In reality, it was a patchwork of strongpoints, some formidable, others little more than hastily dug trenches. Yet, in the propaganda posters plastered across Europe, the wall was depicted as unbroken, stretching across cliffs and beaches like an unyielding shield. By 1944, over 15,000 bunkers, gun emplacements, and obstacles had been built along the French coast. The work was carried out by forced laborers, many of them prisoners and conscripts, digging, pouring concrete, and wiring explosives under the watchful eyes of German overseers. Coastal towns were scarred by construction, their harbors turned into fortresses, and their beaches transformed into killing zones. Heavy artillery pieces, some captured from conquered nations, were embedded in steel-reinforced bunkers pointing out to sea. The wall was Hitler's answer to the threat of a second front, and for the men who would soon face it, it was a nightmare made real. The man tasked with strengthening this wall in 1944 was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox of North Africa. Rommel had earned respect as a daring and resourceful commander, but in France his mission was different: to turn a coastline into a death trap. He travelled tirelessly along the beaches, inspecting defences from the low tide line to the cliffs beyond. His eye for detail was legendary. He would step out onto the sand, crouch by obstacles, and imagine the invasion through the eyes of the attacker. What he saw alarmed him. Long stretches of coast remained weak, with insufficient mines and incomplete bunkers. Rommel drove his engineers relentlessly, ordering hundreds of thousands of obstacles planted along the beaches. His philosophy was simple: the invasion must be destroyed on the shore, for once the Allies broke inland, Germany's armoured reserves would be too slow to respond. He clashed with other German commanders, who believed in holding back their forces for a decisive counterattack. To Rommel, delay was fatal, and only instant, overwhelming resistance could succeed. In the spring of 1944, he threw himself into this task with desperate urgency. The obstacles Rommel ordered became infamous in their variety and brutality. Steel hedgehogs, angled beams designed to rip open landing craft, were planted in rows across the tidal zones. Wooden stakes topped with mines, nicknamed Rommel's asparagus, jutted from the sand to destroy incoming boats at high tide. Teller mines were buried just beneath the surface, ready to explode under the weight of tanks. Coal troughs and jagged rails lurked beneath the waves, invisible to approaching soldiers until it was too late. Entire fields inland were sown with mines, creating lethal traps for infantry and vehicles alike. Bunkers housed machine guns with interlocking fields of fire, designed to mow down invaders before they reached the dunes. Artillery batteries, hidden in casemates of reinforced concrete, could unleash devastating barrages onto the beaches. Even natural features like cliffs and marshes were woven into the defense plan, turning geography into a weapon. Rommel knew that each obstacle slowed the invader, forcing them to bunch up under fire. His goal was not just to kill, but to paralyze. The scale of Rommel's defensive preparations was immense, yet it was a race against time he could never win. He ordered 6 million mines to be laid along the French coast, but by June 1944, less than half had been installed. Bunkers rose slowly, hindered by shortages of steel, concrete, and labor. The Luftwaffe, once a mighty shield against Allied bombers, could no longer protect construction sites from daily air raids. Resistance sabotage delayed progress further, as rail lines carrying supplies were blown apart night after night. Rommel grew increasingly frustrated, reporting that the Atlantic Wall was far from complete, despite Hitler's grandiose claims. He personally berated officers, demanding faster results, yet even his energy could not overcome the shortages. German soldiers muttered that the wall was more propaganda than protection, a bluff to scare the Allies. Still, for those who walked its beaches, the defences appeared formidable enough, and even an incomplete fortress can kill thousands. While Rommel pushed for immediate defence at the shoreline, his superiors in Berlin argued for a different strategy. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the west, believed in holding back armoured divisions to launch a massive counterattack once the enemy revealed their main landing site. He feared committing too much strength too soon, leaving the coast vulnerable to feints and diversions. Hitler, as usual, refused to choose decisively, splitting the difference in a way that weakened both strategies. Rommel was given some authority to fortify the beaches, but not full control of the panzer reserves. As a result, on D-Day, powerful armoured divisions sat inland, waiting for orders that never came. The paralysis of German command structure, worsened by Hitler's interference, became the wall's greatest flaw. Soldiers in the bunkers might fight to the death, but without rapid reinforcement, they could be overwhelmed. Rommel saw this clearly, but his warnings were drowned in the chaos of competing doctrines, and so the wall stood strong in appearance, but hollow at its core. Despite its weaknesses, the Atlantic Wall carried immense psychological weight. German propaganda trumpeted its strength, assuring soldiers and civilians alike that no invasion could succeed. Posters declared, "Fortress Europe is impregnable," while Nazi newsreels showed massive bunkers looming over the surf. For Allied soldiers preparing in England, the wall became a shadow that haunted their dreams. They studied photographs and models, memorizing every machine gun nest and artillery emplacement. Veterans of Dieppe remembered how German fire had shredded a landing force in minutes. Many wondered if Normandy would be a larger version of the same disaster. To assault such a line required courage on a scale few could imagine. For the Germans manning the bunkers, the wall offered reassurance that their positions were unassailable. And yet deep down, some sensed the cracks beneath the concrete. On his inspection tours, Rommel carried with him not only an engineer's eye, but a soldier's dread. He had fought the British in North Africa and respected the power of Allied air forces and artillery. He told his staff bluntly that if the Allies reached the beaches with their full strength, Germany would lose the war. He pressed his men to imagine the invasion as he did swarms of landing craft, skies blackened with aircraft, beaches littered with corpses. His urgency was infectious, pushing units to greater effort, but it also revealed his own anxieties. Rommel knew that the Reich was no longer the master of the skies or the seas. He saw the armoured might gathering across the Channel, even as Hitler dismissed it as deception. On the beaches of Normandy, he tried to build a shield against inevitability, but in his heart, he wondered if even the strongest wall could hold back the tide, and that doubt made his work all the more frantic. The Atlantic Wall was both a triumph and an illusion, a structure of steel and stone built upon fragile foundations. It gave German soldiers confidence and filled Allied hearts with dread, yet it was incomplete, undermanned, and poorly coordinated. Its guns could devastate invaders, but only if reinforcements arrived in time. Its mines and obstacles could maim thousands, but only if the attackers were slowed long enough for counterattacks. To the outside world it appeared unbreakable, stretching across Europe like a scar. But within it was riddled with shortages, disagreements, and overconfidence. On June 6, 1944, it would be tested by the greatest invasion in history. For the men waiting in the bunkers, the wall was their shield, their duty, and their fate. For the men preparing to land, it was a gauntlet of death that had to be crossed. And when the two forces collided, The myth of the Atlantic Wall would meet the reality of war. The invasion of Europe was originally set for June 5, 1944, a date chosen with meticulous attention to tides, moonlight, and daylight hours. The planners required a full moon to guide paratroopers, a low tide at dawn to expose beach obstacles, and enough daylight to allow engineers to clear defenses. Such conditions occurred only a few days each month, making timing as critical as strategy. Yet as June approached, the English Channel turned hostile, whipped into fury by Atlantic storms. Winds howled across the water, waves smashed against the coast, and clouds rolled thick over the skies. Meteorologists delivered grim forecasts, warning that landings under such conditions would be suicide. Landing craft would swamp, aircraft would scatter, and soldiers would be thrown into chaos before they even reached the beaches. Eisenhower faced the prospect of postponing the greatest invasion in history, and with every hour of delay, the risk of discovery grew heavier. At the heart of this decision were the weather team's unsung heroes, whose calculations carried the fate of nations. The Allies relied on a unique advantage: access to Atlantic weather data from stations in Greenland, Iceland, and ships at sea. The Germans, blinded by lack of Western stations, predicted calmer weather than reality, giving the Allies an edge. James Stagg, the Scottish chief meteorological advisor, presented the forecasts to Eisenhower and his commanders. He explained that storms would batter the Channel on June 5th, but a brief window of improved weather might open on June 6. His words were tentative, filled with caution, for weather prediction in 1944 was still more art than science. The room fell silent as generals weighed the gamble, their maps littered with arrows pointing toward Normandy. To wait meant postponing for weeks, risking leaks, desertion, and loss of momentum. To go meant trusting the skies themselves, not to betray them, and in that tension, the invasion hung suspended. Eisenhower convened his senior commanders at Southwick House, a quiet estate near Portsmouth that had become the brain of Operation Overlord. The room was filled with cigarette smoke, the air heavy with exhaustion after years of planning. Montgomery argued for caution, but leaned towards seizing the fleeting opportunity. Admiral Ramsay worried that high seas would capsize landing craft and scatter the fleet. Lee Mallory, responsible for the airborne drops, warned of catastrophe if paratroopers were scattered across the countryside. Air Marshal Tedder pressed that air cover depended on clear skies, without which bombers could not neutralize German defenses. Each voice carried the weight of thousands of men who would live or die by the decision. Eisenhower listened in silence, pacing, his face set in grim concentration. When the argument subsided, he asked Stagg one more time about the weather window. Stagg's cautious optimism became the pivot of history. The decision to go on June 6th was Eisenhower's alone, and it marked the most critical gamble of the war. He understood that failure could cost him his command, and perhaps the entire Allied cause, yet he also knew that delay would erode secrecy, as millions of soldiers could not remain hidden indefinitely. After a long pause, he uttered the words, "Okay, let's go." It was a phrase delivered with calm finality, but beneath it lay the full weight of history. At that moment, 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 men were committed to the storm. The order rippled outward, carried through telephones, radios, and dispatches to every corner of southern England. Sailors prepared their vessels, pilots checked their aircraft, and soldiers were told to ready themselves for embarkation. The die had been cast, and the invasion would proceed with the dawn. And as the order spread, excitement and fear swept through the camps like fire through dry grass. For the soldiers, the final hours before D-Day were a strange mixture of monotony and terror. They cleaned rifles, checked equipment, and packed gear with ritual precision. Helmets were adjusted, gas masks strapped, and waterproofed packs secured against the coming surf. Medics issued sulfur packets and morphine syrettes, grim reminders of wounds to come. Chaplains moved among the men, offering prayers, blessings, and words of comfort. Letters home were written in haste, folded into pockets, or handed to comrades with instructions to deliver them if the worst happened. Some men played cards or sang songs, masking fear with bravado. Others sat quietly, staring at photographs of wives, sweethearts, or children. In every barrack and tent, anticipation throbbed like a heartbeat, steady yet unrelenting, and as night fell, the waiting became harder than the fighting to come. In the ports and harbours of southern England, the scale of the embarkation was staggering. Soldiers filed onto ships in endless lines, their boots echoing on gangways as officers checked rosters. Landing craft bobbed in the water, their decks crowded with men and equipment, lashed tight against the swell. The channel, though calmer than the day before, still churned with waves that sent vessels rocking. Destroyers and battleships loomed in the harbours, their guns pointing outward, silent but ready. Airfields buzzed with activity as paratroopers strapped on gear, weighed down by more than 100 pounds each. Gliders were hitched to tow planes, their fragile frames creaking under strain. Pilots received last-minute briefings, their maps marked with bridges, fields, and rivers to be seized. Above it all, the hum of engines filled the night, a low chorus that seemed to vibrate across the countryside. England itself felt alive, trembling beneath the weight of an army on the move, and every hour brought the storm closer. The commanders did not share the soldiers' nervous camaraderie, for their burden was heavier and lonelier. Eisenhower walked the fields where paratroopers gathered, speaking softly to men of the 101st Airborne. He told them their courage would inspire the world, though his voice nearly broke with the weight of the moment. Photographs captured him surrounded by young men grinning and joking, unaware of how many would never return. Bradley studied maps obsessively, memorizing every beach, village, and road his men would fight across. Montgomery sharpened his plans, insisting again that success required overwhelming force at every point. Naval officers fretted over tides and currents, knowing that even the best plans could unravel in rough seas. Air commanders checked fuel reserves and bomb loads, aware that weather could still ground entire fleets. Each leader carried the knowledge that thousands of lives depended on his judgment, and in their silence the loneliness of command was etched deeply into their faces. As the final hours slipped away, the vast machinery of Overlord moved inexorably toward its moment of truth. Convoys of ships slipped quietly out of harbours, their lights blacked out against the night. Paratroopers climbed into C-47s, their faces pale in the glow of cabin lamps, their helmets heavy with straps and gear. Soldiers in landing craft huddled against the spray, staring into the darkness where France awaited. Officers checked watches, counted men, and whispered orders drowned by the roar of engines. Overhead, the skies filled with the thunder of aircraft, a swarm of wings carrying the first blows of the invasion. In farmhouses and villages across southern England, civilians watched the spectacle in silence, aware that history was passing before their eyes. The channel churned with the movement of fleets, stretching horizon to horizon in a tide of steel. And somewhere across that black water, German sentries stared into the night, unaware that the storm was coming. The world held its breath in those final hours, and with dawn, silence would give way to fire. As the clock struck midnight on June 6, 1944, the first blows of Operation Overlord did not come from the sea, but from the skies. Thousands of paratroopers climbed into their C-47 transport planes, engines roaring like an unending thunder rolling over the English countryside. Each man carried nearly 100 pounds of gear, rifles, grenades, rations, radios, and demolition charges. Faces were smeared with blackened paint, helmets strapped tight, and hearts beating with a mixture of dread and anticipation. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions prepared to leap into darkness, tasked with seizing roads, bridges, and towns, critical to blocking German counterattacks. British 6th Airborne prepared for their own mission across the Channel to hold the eastern flank of the invasion and capture vital crossings over the River Orne. The planes lifted off one after another, stretching across the night sky in long lumbering columns. Inside, the paratroopers sat in silence, the drone of engines so loud it rattled their bones. Some clutched rosaries, others letters, all knowing this would be their crucible. And as they crossed into enemy skies, flak began to bloom like fiery flowers in the night. The jump into Normandy was chaos from the very first moment. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the skies, shredding the darkness with streaks of orange and red. Pilots swerved violently to avoid destruction, scattering formations across the countryside. Paratroopers were hurled from planes at the wrong altitudes, some too low to fully deploy their chutes. Others landed miles from their designated drop zones, tumbling into fields, swamps, and even flooded marshlands set deliberately by the Germans. Equipment bundles were lost, radios smashed on impact, and units scattered in every direction. Men drowned in flooded fields, weighed down by their gear before they could cut themselves free. Some landed directly into German positions, fighting for their lives the moment their boots touched the ground. In the darkness, Normandy became a patchwork of small, desperate battles fought by isolated groups. Confusion reigned, but amid that confusion, courage blazed. The 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, had been tasked with securing the causeways behind Utah Beach. These narrow roads, rising above flooded fields, would be the only routes inland for American forces once they landed. Scattered and leaderless, the paratroopers improvised with remarkable resilience. Small groups of men, often led by sergeants rather than officers, banded together and pressed toward their objectives. They fought through hedgerows, ambushed German patrols, and seized villages one farm at a time. In Carentan, Sainte-Marie-de-Mont, and countless nameless crossroads, they blocked German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Their actions were fragmented, uncoordinated, and often desperate. Yet the effect was powerful, sowing confusion among German defenders who believed they faced far larger forces. By dawn, the Screaming Eagles held critical ground, ensuring that Utah Beach would not be strangled at birth, and in their chaos lay the seeds of success. The 82nd Airborne, the All-American Division, had an equally vital mission to seize key crossings over the Murderette River and the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. Sainte-Mère-Église became the first town liberated in France, though its capture came with heavy sacrifice. Paratroopers dropped directly into the village square, some caught in trees and power lines as German defenders opened fire. One soldier, John Steele, became immortalized when his parachute snagged on the church steeple, leaving him dangling for hours as fighting raged below. His survival became a symbol of the randomness of war, where fate and courage intertwined. Despite the confusion, the 82nd held the town, securing vital roads and bridges. Other groups fought bitterly along the Murderette, with some units isolated for days before linking up. Their tenacity delayed German armored movements that might have crushed the beachheads. By the end of the first day, the All-Americans had carved footholds deep behind enemy lines, and their sacrifice gave the invasion the space it needed to breathe. To the east, the British 6th Airborne Division launched their own daring strike under the cover of night. Their mission was to secure the bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal, preventing German armor from sweeping into the invasion's flank. The most famous of these objectives was Pegasus Bridge, where glider troops executed one of the most precise assaults of the war. At 0:16 hours, 6 Horsa gliders crash-landed just yards from the bridge, their noses splintering as men tumbled out into the darkness. Led by Major John Howard, the British stormed the position in minutes, overwhelming the German defenders. The capture was textbook perfect, securing the bridge intact before German reinforcements could arrive. Elsewhere, the 6th seized Merville Battery, a fortified gun position that threatened Sword Beach. Though scattered like their American counterparts, the British paratroopers fought with fierce determination. Their success ensured the eastern flank remained secure for the landings to come, and their bravery at Pegasus Bridge became legend before dawn even broke. Everywhere across Normandy, the night sky was alive with fire, confusion, and unexpected heroics. Paratroopers cut themselves free from hedgerows, regrouping by the sound of shouted passwords, flash answered by thunder in the darkness. Men with no officers assumed command, leading handfuls of survivors toward objectives they had memorized from sand tables in England. Villagers peered from windows, astonished to see liberation descending from the skies. Some locals guided paratroopers with whispers and gestures, risking execution if discovered by the Germans. German troops, stunned by the sudden presence of thousands behind their lines, fought back fiercely but without coordination. Roadblocks erupted in firefights, farmhouses became fortresses, and every field seemed alive with shadows. By dawn, units that had begun scattered and broken had coalesced into a force strong enough to hold key ground. The chaos had been turned into advantage, bewildering the enemy at the very moment precision seemed most needed. And in that paradox lay the genius of airborne warfare. Yet the cost of the midnight landings was brutal, a reminder that courage never comes without sacrifice. Hundreds of paratroopers were killed before they could fire a shot, their bodies found hanging from trees or lying in flooded fields. Entire sticks of men were lost in the darkness, never to be accounted for again. Gliders crashed into hedgerows, shattering on impact and killing crews before they touched the fight. Others landed in swamps or rivers, drowning soldiers trapped under wreckage. For medics, the night was a nightmare of scattered casualties, impossible to reach quickly in the confusion. Survivors often fought with little more than what they carried, cut off from heavy weapons and supplies. Yet even in loss, their presence fractured German defenses in ways that could not be undone. Every firefight pinned down an enemy platoon. Every skirmish delayed reinforcements by precious minutes. And those minutes would mean everything when the beaches came alive at dawn. By sunrise on June 6th, the airborne divisions had endured chaos, dispersal, and terrible casualties. But they had succeeded. Roads were blocked, bridges were held, and German reinforcements struggled to organize. The Allies had carved a web of disruption across the Norman countryside, setting the stage for the seaborne landings. Eisenhower's gamble on airborne troops, questioned by many, had paid off in ways no one could have fully predicted. What looked like disaster on paper became advantage in reality, as German commanders misread the scale of the threat. For the men who fought that night, it was a test of endurance, improvisation, and raw courage. They had jumped into darkness and found their way through confusion to victory. Their heroics ensured that the beaches would not stand alone, and their story remains one of the most extraordinary chapters of D-Day. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the surface of the English Channel revealed a sight so vast it defied belief. Stretching from horizon to horizon, over 5,000 ships moved in formation, the largest armada ever assembled in human history. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers sailed alongside transports, landing craft, and merchant vessels, a river of steel flowing toward France. Sailors lined the decks, staring in silence at the magnitude of the fleet around them. For the men aboard, it felt as if the sea itself had been transformed into an army, a floating city bristling with guns and determination. The hum of engines and the slap of waves against hulls blended into a steady rhythmic pulse, the heartbeat of the invasion. Command ships signaled orders with flashes of light and bursts of radio traffic, keeping the vast formation coordinated. Minesweepers plowed ahead, clearing paths through waters seeded with German explosives. Behind them came wave after wave of troopships, each loaded with men staring into the grey horizon where their destiny awaited. And above it all, the rising sun revealed the Armada to the enemy for the first time. The naval bombardment began with a thunder that shook the earth itself. Battleships like US Texas, HMS Warspite, and the French battleship Cobra unleashed their massive guns against German coastal defenses. Shells weighing over a ton arced through the morning sky, their impact sending fountains of earth and fire high into the air. Entire bunkers shuddered under the force, their concrete cracked, their defenders dazed by the shock waves. Cruisers and destroyers closed in closer, their smaller caliber guns delivering relentless barrages against strong points and machine gun nests. Naval gunners worked with precision, adjusting fire based on spotters in aircraft overhead. Along the coast, villages, fields, and fortifications vanished beneath curtains of smoke and flame. The roar was constant, a rolling drumbeat of destruction meant to soften the Atlantic wall. For Allied soldiers waiting offshore, the bombardment was both terrifying and reassuring. It was proof that the full weight of naval power stood behind them, and yet many feared it would not be enough. Above the beaches, the air was equally alive with destruction. Allied bombers flew thousands of sorties, dropping tons of explosives on German defenses and transportation hubs. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the Lancaster struck rail yards, bridges, and artillery positions further inland. Medium bombers pounded gun emplacements, while fighter bombers strafed convoys and communication lines. Clouds of smoke rose from the coastline, obscuring fields and villages as the thunder rolled on. Pilots risked flak and machine gun fire to deliver their payloads with accuracy, diving low over hedgerows and cliffs. In the skies, swarms of Spitfires, Mustangs, and Thunderbolts circled overhead, protecting the fleet from the Luftwaffe. But the Luftwaffe did not come in strength, its forces crippled by years of attrition and fuel shortages. A few German fighters appeared, but they were swiftly cut down by the superior Allied numbers. For the men below, the dominance of the skies was absolute, and that dominance gave the invasion its vital shield. Despite the fury of the bombardment, not every German position was silenced. Many bunkers had been built deep into the earth, with walls of reinforced concrete that even the largest shells could not destroy. German defenders, shaken but alive, emerged from the smoke as the bombardment lifted, their machine guns and artillery ready. The effectiveness of the bombardment varied by sector. Some beaches were softened, while others remained deadly strongholds. At Omaha, in particular, German defenses would prove terrifyingly intact. But in the early hours, confusion reigned in German command posts as conflicting reports flooded in. Some officers believed the bombardment was only a diversion, certain that the real invasion would come at Calais. Others tried desperately to contact higher command, only to find communications disrupted by bombing and sabotage. German headquarters, paralyzed by uncertainty, failed to release reserves in time. The thunder of guns had not just broken concrete, it had fractured German decision-making. and that fracture would prove as decisive as any shell. For the men aboard the transports, the bombardment was a spectacle of unimaginable power. Soldiers leaned against the rails, watching columns of smoke rise from the beaches they would soon storm. The noise was deafening, a constant roar punctuated by the crashing of waves against steel hulls. Some cheered at every distant explosion, convinced the enemy was being obliterated. Others sat in silence, clutching rifles, knowing that no amount of fire could kill every defender. Chaplains moved among them, offering last blessings, while officers shouted orders over the din of engines and guns. The air stank of fuel, salt and cordite, a mixture that seared itself into memory. Above them, aircraft droned endlessly, the sky vibrating with the sound of wings. Each man felt small amid the machinery of war, yet part of something vast and unstoppable. And as the bombardment raged on, the moment of decision crept closer with every passing minute. The German defenders, caught between shock and disbelief, struggled to comprehend the scale of what unfolded before their eyes. From their bunkers they saw an armada stretching to the horizon, a vision that seemed impossible even to hardened veterans. Reports flooded in paratroopers behind their lines, bombardments from air and sea, villages in flames. Commanders demanded clarity, but clarity was impossible amid the chaos. Hitler had convinced himself that Normandy was a diversion, and his staff hesitated to commit armoured reserves. Rommel, away in Germany for his wife's birthday, could not take immediate command of the defence. Von Rundstedt, the senior commander in the West, urged counterattack, but was paralysed by Hitler's need for direct approval. Hours slipped away as the tide of invasion grew stronger. German gunners did their duty, manning their weapons and waiting for the bombardment to lift. But in those hours of hesitation, the Allies secured their foothold on history. The sight of the fleet alone was enough to shake German morale. Soldiers who had believed the Atlantic Wall impregnable now faced an enemy of unimaginable scale. Every wave brought more ships, more aircraft, more destruction raining from sky and sea. Even seasoned officers confessed later that the sheer magnitude of the Armada was overwhelming, greater than anything they had been trained to repel. Yet many fought on, firing from bunkers that shook with each impact, clinging to duty as chaos erupted around them. Civilians in the villages nearby cowered in cellars, their homes shaking under bombardment, unaware that liberation had begun. German reserves sat idle, waiting for orders that never came, while Allied troops moved closer with every passing minute. The beaches were about to ignite in fire and blood, but already the Allies had achieved what they needed most: shock, confusion, and delay, and in war delay can be as fatal as defeat. As the bombardment reached its crescendo, the Armada edged closer to the French shore, preparing to release its human cargo. Landing craft began to circle into formation, their ramps rattling, their decks crammed with men gripping rifles and staring into the smoke. Destroyers fired their final salvos, their guns glowing red-hot from relentless barrages. The sky, once dark with bombers, now cleared to reveal the silhouette of France ahead. German defenders tightened their grips on triggers, bracing for the moment the sea would deliver the enemy to their sand. For the Allies there was no turning back. The bombardment had opened the gates, but it was the men who would have to walk through. Eisenhower's gamble had moved from planning rooms to the beaches of Normandy, where courage would meet concrete. The fleet stretched to the horizon, the greatest host of warships ever seen. And with the rising of the tide, the true battle of D-Day was about to begin. The Armada had set sail, and history sailed with it. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the first American wave approached Utah Beach, the westernmost of the 5 landing sectors. The assault was led by the U.S. 4th Infantry Division under the command of General Barton. supported by elements of the 82nd and 101st Airborne already fighting inland. The seas were rough, the air thick with smoke from naval bombardment, and the coastline appeared as a grey silhouette through the mist. Landing craft heaved violently as they approached the shore, their ramps rattling with every wave. Soldiers crouched low, gripping rifles and grenades, while officers barked final instructions over the roar of engines. The plan was precise, with each company assigned a narrow stretch of sand, but precision has no place in the chaos of war. Strong currents and the morning tide pulled the first waves nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended landing zones. By chance or fate, the Americans were about to storm a different beach than the one marked on their maps, and that error would change everything. The miscalculation could have spelled disaster. For amphibious assaults often succeed or fail based on exact timing and positioning. Yet at Utah Beach, fortune favored the Americans in an extraordinary twist of fate. The sector where they came ashore was less heavily defended than the planned target, with fewer bunkers and machine gun nests. German defenders in the area were poorly supplied, many belonging to static divisions composed of older men and conscripts. Their weapons were still lethal, machine guns, mortars, and artillery hidden behind dunes. But the scale of resistance was lighter than elsewhere. Naval bombardments had already destroyed some of the stronger positions, leaving only scattered fire to greet the first waves. Soldiers splashed into the surf, some chest deep in water, wading through the tide as bullets cracked overhead. Casualties came, but in far smaller numbers than planners had feared. Within minutes, men were pushing past the seawall, cutting wire and clearing mines. What began as a mistake had become an unexpected gift. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, became the unlikely hero of Utah Beach. At 56 years old, and walking with a cane from arthritis, he insisted on leading the first wave ashore. When he realized the landings had drifted far south, he calmly surveyed the situation amid gunfire and chaos. Turning to his men, he famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." His decisiveness prevented confusion from turning into catastrophe, rallying troops to seize their objectives, regardless of the map. Roosevelt moved among his soldiers with fearless composure, directing units, encouraging men, and leading assaults against enemy strongpoints. His leadership under fire earned him the Medal of Honor, though he would not live to see the war's end. At that moment, however, his calm determination steadied the entire landing force. And Utah Beach, unlike its blood-soaked counterpart Omaha, began with confidence rather than despair. The terrain at Utah played a crucial role in shaping the battle. Behind the beaches stretched vast flooded fields, deliberately inundated by German engineers to hinder movement. The only routes inland were narrow causeways, elevated roads that ran across the marshes like fragile lifelines. Securing these causeways was the critical task of the airborne divisions dropped hours earlier. Despite their chaotic dispersal, the 82nd and 101st had seized key bridges and crossroads, holding them against German counterattacks. Their sacrifices meant that the infantry from Utah could push inland without being trapped on the beaches. Engineers worked quickly to clear mines and obstacles from the causeways, often under sniper fire. Jeeps, half-tracks, and Sherman tanks began to move off the sand, rolling across the narrow paths into Normandy. The link between airborne and seaborne troops was fragile, but it held, and through that link, the invasion's western flank began to solidify. Casualties at Utah Beach were remarkably low compared to the carnage elsewhere. Out of 23,000 men who landed on June 6th, fewer than 200 were killed, a figure astonishingly light for an amphibious assault. This did not diminish the courage required. for each man who stepped onto the sand knew the price could be far higher. Soldiers dashed across open ground, ducking behind dunes and craters as machine gun bursts swept the beach. Medics crawled through the surf, dragging wounded comrades to safety under fire. Engineers detonated charges against obstacles, sending fountains of sand and steel into the air. Sherman tanks fitted with flotation screens lumbered ashore, their ungainly frames defying the surf. Mortar shells fell among the waves, sending geysers of water skyward. Yet despite the danger, momentum never faltered. Utah Beach was becoming the textbook example of how a landing could succeed. German resistance was fragmented and hesitant, hampered by poor communication and Allied dominance in the air and sea. Attempts to bring reinforcements toward the beach were shredded by fighter bombers strafing roads and bridges. Artillery that might have destroyed the causeways was silenced by naval gunfire, shells raining down with merciless accuracy. Local defenders fought bravely, but they lacked coordination and reserves. Officers struggled to understand whether Utah was the main landing or merely a diversion. This hesitation cost them dearly. As every hour the Americans grew stronger. By midday, infantry battalions were pushing 2 miles inland, linking up with scattered paratroopers. Tanks rolled off landing craft in steady streams, their guns scanning hedgerows for ambushes. Supply dumps were already being established on the beach, ensuring the flow of ammunition and fuel. Utah was no longer just a foothold, it was a gateway. For the soldiers who survived the first waves, the memory of Utah was a blur of noise, smoke, and adrenaline. The crash of naval guns blended with the rattle of machine guns and the shouts of officers driving men forward. Sand stung their faces as explosions ripped craters into the dunes. The weight of wet uniforms and gear dragged them down, yet adrenaline carried them onward. Some recalled moments of surreal calm, birds flying overhead, or the sight of French farmhouses on the horizon. Others remembered the smell of salt, fuel, and cordite mixing in the air. Friendships were forged in those minutes, as men pulled one another from the surf and pressed inland together. By evening, many would struggle to recall exactly how they had survived, but all knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Utah Beach had defied the nightmare of amphibious warfare. By nightfall, the 4th Infantry Division had secured its objectives, linking with airborne units and pushing up to 4 miles inland. The western flank of the invasion was anchored, protecting the vast Armada still unloading behind them. Utah had cost lives, but compared to the bloodbath at Omaha, it was a stunning success. The miscalculation that might have doomed the landing had, in truth, delivered it into weaker defenses. Luck, leadership, and relentless preparation had combined to shape the day's outcome. The Americans now stood firmly on French soil, their boots muddy with the fields of Normandy. Behind them, the beaches swarmed with reinforcements, vehicles and supplies flowing ashore. Ahead of them lay hedgerows, villages, and German strongpoints yet to be taken. But the first step had been secured, and with it the promise of liberation. Utah Beach had opened the door, and through that door the Allies would march toward victory. If Utah was the landing that went right, Omaha was the one that nearly failed. Stretching 4 miles along the Norman coast, Omaha Beach was a crescent of sand, flanked by cliffs and bluffs that loomed like natural fortresses. The Germans had fortified it with meticulous care, embedding bunkers, trenches, and machine gun nests into the high ground. The defenders were not second-rate troops, but seasoned soldiers of the 352nd Infantry Division, veterans hardened on the Eastern Front. Their fields of fire overlapped across the beach, creating a killing ground with no place to hide. Allied planners had counted on air and naval bombardments to break the defenses before the infantry arrived. But the bombers, flying through heavy cloud cover, released their payloads too far inland, leaving bunkers untouched. Naval shells landed with fury, but many missed their targets or failed to penetrate reinforced concrete. The result was that when the first American waves came ashore, the German defenses were still fully alive, and Omaha Beach awaited them like a slaughterhouse. The first assault waves belonged to the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and the 29th Infantry Division, making their baptism of fire. As their landing craft drew near, they faced withering fire from artillery and machine guns raking the water. Ramp doors dropped, and entire squads were cut down before they could take a step. Men leapt into the surf, some drowning under the weight of gear in water too deep to wade. Others crawled through the tide, shells exploding around them, waves stained with blood. Engineers carrying explosives to clear obstacles were among the first targeted, leaving the beach littered with mines and iron defenses. Tanks fitted with flotation screens were meant to provide cover, but most sank in the rough seas before reaching shore. A few Shermans made it to land, only to be destroyed within minutes by German guns. Survivors clung to shingle banks and seawalls, pinned down with no way forward. Omaha was chaos, terror and death compressed into every yard of sand. The terrain made Omaha uniquely lethal, amplifying German firepower with every natural advantage. The bluffs rose steeply behind the beach, covered in grass, brush, and fortified positions that overlooked the shoreline. Narrow draws or gullies offered the only routes inland, and each one was zeroed in by mortars, artillery, and interlocking machine guns. The Germans had placed obstacles across the tidal zone, wooden stakes tipped with mines, steel hedgehogs, and rails that trapped landing craft. Mines exploded beneath the waves, ripping apart boats and men alike. Snipers fired from concealed positions in farmhouses and bunkers, picking off officers and medics. Mortar shells rained down without pause, bursting among groups of men huddled in the sand. The beach became a nightmare of bodies, burning wreckage and shattered equipment. For hours it seemed the landing would collapse, the invasion at Omaha bleeding to death in the surf, and still the waves kept coming, soldiers wading into the firestorm because there was no turning back. Leadership faltered, as units were decimated, officers killed, and communication lines severed. Radios were destroyed in the surf, leaving soldiers without contact to higher command. Landing schedules disintegrated, as craft were scattered, depositing units in the wrong sectors or dropping them late. Men who had trained for specific objectives now found themselves leaderless, stranded, and improvising for survival. Some clung to the seawall, paralyzed, while others crawled forward inch by inch through barbed wire and mines. Engineers, many of them wounded, continued their grim task of blowing gaps through obstacles with Bangalore torpedoes. Chaplains moved among the fallen, giving last rites as bullets cracked overhead. Medics used helmets as makeshift basins to wash wounds, their white armbands no protection against German fire. It was a battle fought less by grand maneuvers than by individual courage, and in that crucible, the fate of Omaha hung by a thread. Amid the chaos, small groups of soldiers began to claw their way forward, turning disaster into possibility. Junior officers and sergeants took command, rallying anyone they could find regardless of unit or division. Captain Joe Dawson of the 16th Infantry led his men up a draw, scaling the bluff under fire to silence German positions. Engineers cleared minefields with their bare hands when their equipment was destroyed, sacrificing themselves so others could advance. Rangers scaled cliffs at Point Dohawk, grappling up sheer rock faces as Germans hurled grenades down upon them. At Veerville and Collierville, Scattered groups assaulted bunkers with grenades, rifles, and sheer determination. No plan survived the morning, but improvisation and courage began to stitch fragments into momentum. Each bunker taken reduced the firepower pouring onto the beach. By midday, the first breakthroughs were opening along the bluffs. Omaha was still bleeding, but it was no longer dying. The cost of those breakthroughs was staggering. By the end of the day, nearly 2,500 Americans had been killed or wounded on Omaha alone. The sand was littered with abandoned rifles, helmets, and the lifeless bodies of men who had never made it past the surf. Smoke hung over the beach like a shroud, the air thick with the stench of cordite and death. Survivors spoke of crawling over comrades to reach cover, of seeing friends vanish in explosions that left nothing behind. Entire companies had been wiped out, reduced to handfuls of men who refused to stop fighting. Naval destroyers, risking grounding themselves, sailed dangerously close to shore to blast German positions with point-blank fire. Their guns silenced bunkers that infantry could not reach, tipping the balance at crucial moments. By evening, the Americans stood on the bluffs, exhausted, bloodied, but victorious. Omaha was secured at a cost that defied imagination, and its story became the darkest yet most heroic chapter of D-Day. For the Germans, Omaha was both a triumph and a tragedy. Their defenses had performed as designed, inflicting massive casualties and nearly repelling the assault. Yet their isolation and lack of reinforcements doomed them as much as Allied courage. Many bunkers fought until their guns ran dry, their defenders killed to the last man. Others surrendered when surrounded, emerging dazed from their concrete fortresses. German officers watched with disbelief as shattered American units reorganized and pushed inland despite the slaughter. Communications with higher command remained fractured, and reserves never arrived in strength. The defenders had been told the wall was impregnable, but they now saw its cracks firsthand. By nightfall, Omaha was lost, despite the blood their bullets had spilled. And for Germany, the loss was the beginning of the end. Omaha Beach remains etched in memory as both a graveyard and a monument. It was the bloodiest of the 5 landing sites, where success came not from flawless planning, but from raw determination. Misplaced bombardments, intact defenses, and murderous resistance nearly turned it into disaster. Yet from that disaster rose moments of heroism that shaped history. Ordinary soldiers, without orders or certainty, pushed forward because retreat was not an option. Their sacrifice secured a foothold where none should have been possible. When Eisenhower later visited the beach, he saw not just victory, but the price of freedom carved into the sand. Today, rows of white crosses on the bluffs above Omaha bear silent witness to that morning's agony. The sands of Normandy drank deeply of blood, but they yielded the ground that opened the road to Europe's liberation. And Omaha Beach became the place where hell was endured and history was made. As the sun rose higher on June 6, 1944, the British assault on Gold Beach began with the thunder of naval guns. The sector stretched nearly 5 miles between La Riviere and Arromanches, defended by elements of the German 716th Infantry Division and the tougher 352nd that had also mauled Americans at Omaha. Concrete bunkers overlooked the sands, armed with 88 guns, mortars and machine guns that covered every approach. The sea was rough, the tide unpredictable, and the beach strewn with obstacles planted to destroy landing craft. For the men of the British 50th Infantry Division, veterans of North Africa and Sicily, this was another chapter in a long, brutal war. They had trained for months on England's shores, studying maps, models, and rehearsals of the beach they would storm. Yet training could never match the reality of charging into steel and fire. The first waves faced fierce resistance, machine guns cutting across the sand and artillery pounding the surf. Casualties mounted quickly as landing craft disgorged their human cargo into the storm. And yet, even in the chaos, the British pressed forward with steady determination. The German defences at Gold were formidable, with gun batteries dug deep into concrete casemates impervious to naval bombardment. The most dangerous was at Le Hamel, where a 75 mm gun commanded the beach approaches with devastating effect. Artillery from the cliffs rained down on the landing craft, sending geysers of seawater and shrapnel into the air. Mortar rounds landed with deadly precision, scattering men as they tried to regroup on the sand. Mines detonated beneath tanks, turning them into blazing wrecks before they could fire a shot. Despite heavy naval fire, many strongpoints remained intact, forcing the infantry to fight their way forward bunker by bunker. German machine gunners, seasoned and disciplined, fired until their barrels glowed red. Resistance was relentless, every yard of sand contested with deadly precision. The cost was high, but the British refused to yield, crawling, charging, and clawing their way toward the seawall. Gold Beach was becoming a battle of endurance, testing the resolve of every man who stepped ashore. To counter the Atlantic Wall, the British unleashed some of the most innovative weapons of the war, Hobart's funnies. These specialized tanks, devised by Major General Percy Hobart, were designed to overcome obstacles that would have stopped ordinary armor. The Crocodile flamethrower tank spewed gouts of fire into bunkers, forcing defenders to abandon their positions in terror. The Churchill AVRE carried a massive mortar known as the Petard, capable of blasting apart concrete fortifications with a single shell. The Crab Flail tank churned chains ahead of it, detonating mines safely before infantry advanced. Duplex-drive Shermans, fitted with flotation screens, swam ashore like ungainly amphibians, providing fire support where men were most vulnerable. Fascine-carrying tanks dropped bundles of logs into craters and anti-tank ditches, creating makeshift bridges for vehicles. Bulldozer tanks cleared wreckage, wire and obstacles under fire, carving paths inland through destruction. These machines were ungainly, awkward and ridiculed in training, but on D-Day they proved their worth. Without them, Gold Beach might have drowned in its own blood. With them, the assault pushed forward. The infantry and armor worked hand in hand, often improvising under withering fire. Engineers detonated Bangalore torpedoes to clear wire, while crocodiles poured flame into gun ports. AVRs lobbed massive shells into bunkers that had survived naval bombardment, their explosions collapsing concrete walls in showers of dust. Infantry squads dashed forward in the aftermath, tossing grenades and clearing rooms in brutal close combat. Casualties were high, but momentum began to shift as strongpoints fell one by one. The defenders fought bitterly, sometimes refusing to surrender even as their positions burned around them. In villages just inland, German units regrouped and counterattacked, forcing house-to-house fighting among stone cottages. Mortar fire echoed through the streets, and snipers harried every advance. Yet the British, seasoned by years of desert warfare, pressed on with stubborn resilience. By mid-morning, the breach in the Atlantic Wall at Gold was undeniable. Behind the assault troops, the logistical lifeline of the invasion surged ashore. Engineers worked frantically to clear lanes through beach obstacles, marking safe paths with flags for incoming waves. Tanks and trucks rolled off landing craft in steady streams, despite the wreckage littering the sand. Artillery units set up batteries on the beach itself, firing inland to suppress German counterattacks. Supply dumps were established among dunes and craters, guarded by MPs directing the flow of traffic. Medics tended to the wounded in improvised aid stations, their white armbands stained with blood and sand. Chaplains offered prayers amid the thunder, steadying men before they pushed forward once more. By afternoon, hundreds of vehicles had already landed, transforming Gold from battlefield to beachhead. Smoke rose in columns from destroyed bunkers, but new lines of trucks carried fuel, ammunition, and rations inland. The system functioned under fire, proving the depth of Allied preparation, and with every hour the foothold grew stronger. As British units pressed further inland, their immediate goal became the capture of Bayeux and the link-up with Canadian forces landing at Juno. The bocage countryside slowed their advance, its hedgerows perfect for German ambushes. Mortar teams and snipers made every lane dangerous, forcing infantry to fight for every field. Yet progress continued, powered by coordination between armor, artillery, and air support. Fighter bombers screamed overhead, striking German convoys, trying to reinforce the beachhead. Naval guns reached inland, their shells obliterating crossroads and strong points that threatened the advance. The Germans counterattacked sporadically, but lacked the armor and reserves needed for a decisive blow. Local civilians, stunned by the battle, emerged from cellars to greet the liberators cautiously. Many offered water, food, or guidance through the maze of Norman lanes. The British, weary but determined, pressed on. By nightfall on June 6th, Gold Beach was firmly in British hands. The 50th Infantry Division had secured a stretch of coastline nearly 10 miles wide and advanced several miles inland. The port of Arromanches was captured, where within days a Mulberry harbour would be constructed, turning the beach into a vital supply hub. The cost had been high, hundreds killed and wounded, tanks lost, and villages reduced to rubble. Yet the victory was decisive, providing a secure anchor for the Allied left flank. German forces in the sector were shattered, their units scattered and unable to mount coordinated counterattacks. The defences that had seemed impregnable at dawn now lay broken, smoking ruins by dusk. Soldiers dug in for the night, fortifying positions against the inevitable counterstrikes to come. Exhaustion weighed heavily, but so did pride, for the beachhead had been won, and with Gold secure, the Allies' great line of invasion was beginning to take shape. Gold Beach was a testament to British resolve and ingenuity, a battle where innovation and determination overcame entrenched defences. The Atlantic Wall had promised to bleed the invaders white, but it had cracked under the weight of Hobart's funnies, naval firepower, and relentless infantry assaults. The lessons of DP had been learned, paid for in blood, and applied with ruthless efficiency on Normandy's shore. For the men who fought there, the memory was one of chaos, terror, and comradeship forged in fire. They had stormed a beach bristling with guns and walked away with victory in their hands. For the Germans, it was proof that even concrete and steel could not hold back a determined enemy. And for history, Gold Beach became the example of what Allied planning and innovation could achieve. The beachhead established there would feed armies, launch offensives, and drive the liberation of France. It was not easy, it was not cheap, but it was secure. And in that security lay the foundation of victory. At Juno Beach, between Gold to the west and Sword to the east, the Canadians faced one of the most daunting assignments of D-Day. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by tanks of the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade, was tasked with storming the 6-mile stretch of coastline near Courcelles-Bernières and Saint-Aubin. Their objectives were ambitious: capture the beach, seize towns along the coastal road, and push inland to link up with British divisions. Yet from the start, nature itself conspired against them. Strong currents swept landing craft off course, scattering units far from their designated sectors. Rough seas churned the channel, soaking soldiers in icy spray, and making men violently seasick before battle even began. Equipment was drenched, rifles clogged with salt water, and radios threatened with failure. The journey to the beach was not only long, it was punishing, a test of endurance before the first shot was fired. Still, the Canadians pressed on, their resolve hardening with every wave that crashed against their craft. They knew their hour had come, and there could be no turning back. As the ramps dropped, the Canadians faced a wall of fire unleashed from fortified German strongpoints. The defenders belonged to the 716th Infantry Division, reinforced by elements of the 21st Panzer, and their positions had been carefully prepared. Concrete bunkers housed machine guns and 88 mm cannons, while trenches and barbed wire covered every approach. Mortars rained shells into the surf, and mines detonated beneath advancing vehicles. The naval bombardment, though devastating, had not silenced enough of the defences, leaving many bunkers alive and firing. Soldiers stumbled into chest-deep water, some drowning under the weight of gear before they reached the sand. Others clawed forward through obstacles, their comrades falling all around them. Engineers detonated charges against seawalls, while infantry stormed up the beach under withering fire. Casualties were heavy in those first minutes, yet the Canadians did not falter. Instead, they surged forward with a determination that stunned their German adversaries. The fighting on the beach was ferocious, but Canadian armour soon began to tip the balance. Duplex-drive Shermans, swimming tanks, emerged from the surf, their ungainly flotation screens dropping as they fired on bunkers at point-blank range. Some sank in the rough seas before reaching shore, swallowed by the waves, their crews lost beneath the surf. But those that survived rolled directly into the fray, blasting pillboxes and providing cover for the infantry. Infantrymen clung to their sides, advancing under the roar of tank guns and the rattle of machine fire. Flamethrower tanks poured liquid fire into firing slits, forcing Germans from their positions. Engineers, protected by armour, blew breaches in seawalls and obstacles, opening lanes for the waves behind. Bit by bit, the momentum shifted, and the defenders began to falter. The beach that had seemed unassailable an hour earlier was now a battleground of burning bunkers and shattered defences. Blood stained the sand, but victory was beginning to take shape, and the Canadians knew they had carved a foothold. Once off the beaches, the Canadians faced the daunting challenge of pushing inland through villages and hedgerows. In Courcelles-sur-Mer, fierce fighting erupted as Germans held stone houses like fortresses, firing from windows and cellars. Grenades and rifles cracked in narrow streets as the Canadians cleared buildings room by room. At Bernier, defenders fought bitterly around the church square, turning the town into a killing zone. Tanks rumbled through the streets, crushing barricades and silencing nests of resistance with shellfire. In Saint-Aubin, artillery pieces hidden behind dunes hammered the advancing infantry until they were overrun in savage close combat. Civilians cowered in cellars, the walls shaking with every explosion, their villages torn apart in the crossfire. Despite the ferocity, Canadian troops moved with relentless determination, seizing one objective after another. By midday, the towns along the coast were in Canadian hands, their flags raised amid smoking ruins. The road inland now lay open, though far from undefended. German counterattacks came swiftly, determined to throw the invaders back into the sea. Elements of the 21st Panzer Division probed the Canadian lines, their tanks and armoured vehicles emerging from hedgerows and farm tracks. Panzer IVs and anti-tank guns engaged the Shermans in deadly duels, shells shrieking across open fields. Mortars and artillery pounded crossroads, hoping to sever the Canadian advance before it could take root. Infantry counterattacks were fierce, Often launched with fanatical resolve, despite being heavily outgunned, the Canadians met them with steady discipline, calling in artillery support and coordinating with naval guns offshore. Warships unleashed devastating salvos inland, breaking up German formations before they could mass. Fighter bombers screamed overhead, strafing columns of armor and scattering troops across the fields. The counterattack slowed the advance, but failed to dislodge the Canadians from their positions. And each failed German thrust cost them time and strength they could not afford to lose. The Canadians pushed inland with surprising speed, advancing farther on D-Day than any other Allied force. By nightfall, some units had penetrated nearly 10 miles, brushing against the outskirts of Pas-de-Calais and approaching the key city of Caen. Their success owed much to their discipline, honed in training and previous battles in Sicily and Italy. Small unit leadership proved decisive, as sergeants and lieutenants rallied men to push through obstacles and counterattacks. Tanks supported every advance, their coordination with infantry honed through months of preparation. Yet the advance came at a heavy cost, with more than 1,000 Canadians killed or wounded before the first day ended. Villages along the route bore the scars of battle, their stone walls shattered, their streets littered with wreckage. Survivors pressed forward grimly, their comrades' sacrifices driving them onward. The Canadians had carved deep into Hitler's fortress Europe in a single day, and their foothold would prove vital in the struggle to come. For the soldiers of the 3rd Division, Juno was remembered as both triumph and trial. They had faced some of the heaviest defenses of any beach, second only to Omaha in its brutality. The surf had nearly drowned them, the bunkers had nearly destroyed them, and German counterattacks had nearly driven them back. Yet at every turn, resilience and courage carried them forward. The names of small towns, Courcelles, Bernier, Saint-Aubin, became etched in memory alongside Canadian sacrifice. Men who had grown up in Toronto, Montreal, and Winnipeg now lay buried in Normandy's fields. Their families would never see them return, but their legacy lived on in the liberation of a continent. Survivors recalled the screams of the wounded, the roar of tank engines and the thunder of naval shells overhead. They also remembered moments of solidarity, a hand pulling them from the surf, a comrade sharing water in the ruins of a farmhouse. Juno Beach was a crucible that tested them, and they did not break. By the end of D-Day, Juno Beach stood as one of the greatest achievements of the Allied landings. The Canadians had suffered more than 1,000 casualties, yet they had secured a wide and deep bridgehead. Their advance reached farther inland than the Americans at Omaha or Utah, or even the British at Gold and Sword. They had linked the invasion line together, closing gaps and preventing the Germans from splitting the beaches apart. Their performance earned respect from allies and enemies alike, proof of their skill and tenacity. For Normandy, their arrival marked the beginning of liberation, as French villagers embraced their unexpected saviors. For Germany, it signaled that Fortress Europe was already crumbling despite its guns, bunkers, and counterattacks. The story of Juno was written in courage, discipline, and sacrifice. It was Canada's hour of destiny on foreign shores, and it ensured that D-Day's momentum could not be undone. Sword Beach was the easternmost landing sector of D-Day, a 4-mile stretch of sand between Ouistreham and Lyon-sur-Mer. The British 3rd Infantry Division, supported by the 27th Armoured Brigade, carried the responsibility of storming it. Their mission was not only to seize the beach, but also to push inland, link with airborne troops at Pegasus Bridge, and advance toward the city of Caen. The sea was choppy, the skies still grey with the smoke of naval bombardments, and the air filled with the roar of aircraft. Landing craft pitched violently, soldiers gripping their weapons as waves drenched them with cold spray. They knew the German 716th Infantry Division held the defences here, reinforced with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank guns dug into the dunes. Coastal batteries at Ouistreham loomed over the sector, their concrete casemates bristling with weapons. Naval fire had struck many positions but not all, and the defenders were waiting. As the ramps dropped, the British charged into the surf with rifles, bayonets, and resolve. The battle for Sword Beach had begun. Resistance on the beach was immediate and intense, though less catastrophic than at Omaha. German machine gunners swept the shoreline, their fire cutting across the sand in deadly arcs. Mortars exploded in geysers, throwing men and equipment into the air. Yet British armour arrived in strength, with amphibious Shermans and specialised Hobart's funnies rumbling ashore. Flail tanks detonated mines with spinning chains, opening safe lanes through the killing ground. Crocodile flamethrowers belched fire into bunkers, silencing positions that naval shells had failed to destroy. Engineers cut wire under fire, blasting obstacles with explosives as infantry surged behind them. Casualties mounted, but momentum did not falter, and within 2 hours the first strongpoints had fallen. By mid-morning, the 3rd Division had secured its beach exits and began pushing inland. Sword was bloodied, but Sword was secure. Beyond the beach, the objective was clear. Link with the paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division, holding the bridges over the Orne River and Caen Canal. Hours earlier, Major John Howard's men had seized Pegasus Bridge in one of the most daring operations of the war. Their gliders had landed with precision, their assault swift and decisive, and now they clung to the bridge under constant pressure. German counterattacks had probed throughout the morning, but the paratroopers held firm with dwindling ammunition. They knew the relief column had to arrive quickly, or their position would collapse. The British infantry advancing from Sword moved steadily through the villages and hedgerows, every mile a struggle. Resistance was fierce in coastal towns, where German garrisons fought from stone houses and narrow lanes. Mortars and artillery harassed the advance, forcing men to take cover before resuming their push. By afternoon, the link-up was within sight, and the fate of the eastern flank hung on the union of beach and bridge. The advance toward Pegasus Bridge was marked by moments of both ferocity and triumph. In Ouistreham, commandos of the 1st Special Service Brigade stormed the town with pipes skirling, led by the legendary Lord Lovat. They fought street by street, clearing machine gun nests and pushing the Germans out of their strongholds. Civilians watched from shattered houses, their liberation unfolding in fire and smoke. From there, the commandos pressed inland, marching with speed to relieve Howard's embattled men. Along the way, they skirmished with pockets of resistance, silencing guns that threatened the beachhead. The sound of bagpipes announced their arrival at Pegasus Bridge, a surreal moment amid the carnage. For the exhausted paratroopers, the sight of infantry reinforcements was salvation. The bridge, still intact, was firmly in Allied hands, and with that link secured, Sword Beach's mission reached its first great success. Yet Sword's story was not only one of triumph, but of looming challenges. The ultimate objective was Caen, the vital city whose capture was essential to controlling Normandy's road network. But the Germans knew this too, and their reserves waited nearby. Elements of the 21st Panzer Division, Germany's only armoured unit close to the beaches, counterattacked with tanks and infantry. Columns of panzers advanced toward the British lines, their guns spitting fire as they tried to cut the invasion in half. British anti-tank crews dug in, firing P-8s and 6-pounder guns at the approaching armour. Naval guns and fighter bombers joined the battle, raining destruction on the German formations. The attack reached the coast near Lyon-sur-Mer, threatening to drive a wedge between Sword and Juno. For a moment the fate of the invasion's eastern flank trembled, but the Germans, lacking coordination and overwhelmed by firepower, fell back. The beachhead held. Holding Sword meant enduring a day of relentless pressure, as German artillery rained shells and sniper fire echoed from every corner. The villages inland became battlefields of their own, fought over at close range with grenades, rifles, and bayonets. Civilians huddled in cellars, the ground shaking with every barrage, their homes turned into fortresses. Engineers worked tirelessly to repair roads and clear mines, allowing reinforcements and armor to move forward. Supply lines were established across the beach, trucks and tanks rolling steadily through the breaches in German defenses. Medics set up aid stations under fire, treating waves of wounded brought back from the front. Communications units erected radio masts, linking the beachhead to command ships offshore. Every element of the invasion machine was engaged, keeping Sword alive amid constant threat. For the soldiers digging in, exhaustion set in, but resolve did not waver. Sword was more than a landing, it was a test of endurance. By nightfall, Sword Beach was firmly linked with Juno to the west and the 6th Airborne to the east. The corridor from the beaches to the Orne was secure, ensuring that German armor could not sweep in to cut the invasion apart. The 3rd Infantry Division had advanced 4 miles inland, though Colden itself remained firmly in German hands. The fighting had been brutal, the cost significant, but the eastern flank of Overlord was anchored. German commanders, shocked by the speed of the Allied build-up, struggled to mount coherent responses. Their armored counterattacks had been blunted, their artillery silenced piece by piece. The defenders who had sworn the Atlantic Wall was unbreakable now saw its cracks laid bare. For the British soldiers, weary and blood-stained, the day ended with foxholes dug and rifles at the ready. The first step was complete, but the battle for Normandy was only beginning, and Sword would play a central role in the struggle to come. Sword Beach was more than just another landing. It was the linchpin of the invasion's eastern flank. Its capture ensured the survival of Pegasus Bridge, the protection of Juno, and the stability of the entire Allied line. The price was steep, measured in lives lost on the sand, in villages and at the bridges that linked the front. Yet the British had prevailed through discipline, firepower, and the resolve to hold under pressure. The sound of bagpipes at Pegasus Bridge became the symbol of a day when tradition and valor met history. For the paratroopers, the commandos, and the infantry alike, Sword was a battle that proved their mettle. It was the bridge between sea and land, between preparation and execution, between survival and victory. As the guns fell silent with the coming of night, the men knew the fight for Caen loomed ahead. Sword had held the line, but the hardest days still waited beyond the horizon. And in its resolve, the fate of Normandy was sealed. By nightfall on June 6th, the beaches of Normandy were littered with the human cost of liberation. Allied forces had secured their footholds, but the price was staggering, more than 10,000 casualties in a single day. Of these, over 4,400 were confirmed dead, their lives cut short in the surf, on the sand, or in the hedgerows beyond. The numbers were spread unevenly across the invasion line, each beach carrying its own burden of sacrifice. At Utah, fewer than 200 Americans were killed, spared by miscalculations that brought them ashore at lighter defenses. At Omaha, nearly 2,500 men were killed or wounded, the sand red with blood from hours of brutal combat. The British at Gold suffered more than 1,000 casualties, while their countrymen at Sword endured nearly 700. The Canadians at Juno lost more than 1,000 in their desperate struggle through surf and villages, and in every sector, the numbers told only part of the story, for behind each statistic lay a soldier, a face, and a family left waiting. Medics were the unsung heroes of D-Day, fighting their own war against time and death. They leapt from landing craft with the infantry, carrying only stretchers, bandages, and morphine, armed with nothing but their courage. Under fire, they crawled across beaches to reach the wounded, their white armbands offering little protection against German bullets. Many medics were killed as they bent over fallen comrades, their sacrifice as silent as it was profound. Those who survived dragged men from the surf, cut away uniforms stiff with blood, and worked with shaking hands amid the thunder of battle. They used helmets as basins, belts as tourniquets, and sand as makeshift pillows for the dying. Some set up aid stations in bomb craters or abandoned bunkers, treating dozens of wounded at once. Their work saved countless lives, though the burden of those they could not save weighed heavily on their hearts. For many soldiers, the last face they saw was not a comrade or an officer, but a medic kneeling at their side, and in those moments, compassion stood against the cruelty of war. Engineers, too, bore a disproportionate share of the sacrifice on D-Day. Tasked with clearing mines, demolishing obstacles, and breaching seawalls, they worked in the most exposed positions. German machine guns singled them out, knowing that without engineers the assault would falter. Many carried heavy Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes packed with explosives that had to be shoved into barbed wire or obstacles before detonation. At Omaha, entire engineer teams were wiped out in minutes, their torpedoes lost in the surf, yet survivors pressed forward, crawling across open sand with explosives in their arms, detonating obstacles even as bullets snapped around them. Naval gunfire and tanks often depended on these men to carve paths through wreckage and wire. Some engineers worked waist-deep in water, cutting stakes and dragging mines by hand. Their courage was quiet, their contribution indispensable. Without engineers, the beachheads would have drowned in their own obstacles. Chaplains moved among the dead and dying, their voices rising above the chaos in prayers and blessings. They carried no weapons, only Bibles and faith, yet their presence steadied men in their darkest hour. On Omaha, Father Joseph Lacey waded ashore amid gunfire, hearing confessions and giving last rites as bullets tore the air. On Juno, Canadian padres prayed over the wounded in ruined farmhouses, comforting soldiers who knew they would not see dawn. Some chaplains carried stretchers alongside medics, hauling the wounded back through fire. Others stood at makeshift graves, reading scripture as comrades hurriedly buried their dead before moving inland. Their words brought solace where hope seemed impossible, anchoring men in the storm of war. Many chaplains were killed in their duty, remembered not for combat but for compassion. Their service was measured not in victories, but in the peace they brought to the dying, and in the blood and smoke of D-Day, their presence reminded soldiers of humanity. The emotional toll of June 6th was felt as deeply as the physical one. For the men who survived, the memories of that day etched scars that lasted a lifetime. They remembered the cries of the wounded echoing across the surf, the smell of smoke and salt and blood mingling in the air. They recalled dragging themselves across sand littered with bodies, every step a reminder of comrades left behind. Some spoke of surreal moments, birds flying overhead, or a farmhouse standing untouched amid devastation that seared into memory. Others never spoke at all, carrying their trauma in silence long after the war had ended. The cost of D-Day was not only measured in casualties, but in the invisible wounds borne by survivors. Fear, grief, and guilt haunted many for decades, shadows cast by the longest day. Liberation came with a price, and it was paid not just in lives lost, but in lives forever changed. And that toll was carried quietly, long after the guns fell silent. For French civilians, D-Day was both salvation and tragedy. The liberation they had long prayed for came with fire and ruin as bombs, shells, and gunfire tore through their villages. Thousands of French civilians were killed on June 6th, caught in the crossfire of the invasion. Families hid in cellars as houses collapsed above them, or fled across fields under artillery fire. Children clung to their parents as villages burned, their lives changed forever in a single day. Yet many also welcomed the soldiers with tears, embracing them as liberators even amid the wreckage of their homes. Women offered water to the wounded, men guided Allied troops through back roads, and priests opened churches as makeshift hospitals. Liberation and loss walked hand in hand across Normandy. The cost of freedom was written not only in Allied blood, but in the suffering of civilians, and their sacrifice, though often forgotten, was part of the price of D-Day. German soldiers, too, paid a heavy price on June 6th. Thousands were killed in their bunkers, trenches, and counterattacks, often fighting to the last bullet. Many were young conscripts from occupied nations forced into German uniforms against their will. Others were seasoned veterans who had fought across Europe and Russia, now trapped in a battle they could not win. For them the cost was not only death, but disillusionment, as the Atlantic Wall crumbled beneath Allied firepower. Some surrendered in shock, emerging from bunkers dazed and bewildered at the scale of the assault. Others refused to yield, dying in positions they had sworn to hold. Their families far away in Germany or occupied Europe would never know where their sons fell. In war the enemy's sacrifice is often forgotten, yet their cost was real and immense. And on D-Day the price of resistance was measured in thousands of German dead. When the sun set on June 6th, the Allies held the beaches, but the sand was soaked with sacrifice. Every yard of ground had been purchased with blood, sweat, and unyielding courage. The casualty figures, stark as they were, could never capture the true weight of the day. Behind each number was a medic who crawled through fire, an engineer who detonated a mine, or a chaplain who whispered prayers to the dying. Behind each statistic was a soldier who had written a letter home, a family who would never see their son return. The cost of D-Day was not just in the thousands buried in Normandy's soil, but in the ripples of grief that spread across oceans and continents. Yet in that sacrifice lay the foundation of liberation, the breaking of tyranny's grip on Europe. The beaches were secured, but at a price that echoed in every heart. D-Day had been won, but it had not been free, and its cost would be remembered for generations. By the evening of June 6th, the Allies had established a fragile line along the Normandy coast. But their hold on France was far from secure. The landings had succeeded in seizing the beaches, yet those beaches were only narrow strips of sand, vulnerable to counterattack. Linking them into a continuous front was vital, for divided footholds could be crushed piecemeal by German armor. The terrain inland was treacherous, dominated by hedgerows, ditches, and villages that turned every advance into a skirmish. Commanders knew the Beachhead could not survive unless the separate invasion sectors, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were connected swiftly. Supplies needed to flow between them, reinforcements had to move without obstruction, and artillery fire had to be coordinated across the line. Engineers worked tirelessly to carve paths through minefields and wreckage, while infantry patrolled constantly to secure ground between sectors. Every movement was contested, every mile fought for in blood and fire. The first 24 hours were not just about landing, they were about holding, and holding meant transforming chaos into cohesion. At Utah Beach, the Americans of the 4th Infantry Division pushed inland with remarkable success, linking with scattered paratroopers of the 101st. The airborne troops had already secured critical causeways across flooded marshes, preventing German reinforcements from severing the beach. Together they fought through fields and villages, clearing pockets of resistance with grenades and rifles. Every crossroad became a battleground, every farmhouse a fortress to be taken. Despite scattered resistance, progress was steady, and by the end of the first day, Utah stood firmly anchored. Yet the situation at Omaha was far more precarious, where American forces had only just secured the bluffs after catastrophic losses. Linking Omaha to Utah became an urgent priority, for the two beaches formed the hinge of the American sector. Patrols probed through the hedgerows, skirmishing with Germans who sought to keep the beaches isolated. Engineers worked to open roads between them, clearing mines and repairing craters. Slowly, painfully, the gap began to close, inch by inch. The British and Canadians faced their own challenges as they sought to connect Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each beach had secured its exits, but German resistance inland remained strong, particularly around the approaches to Calais. Villages like Courcelles, Bernier, and Lyon-sur-Mer were contested fiercely, with snipers, mortars, and machine guns harassing every advance. Still, Canadian units pressed forward with grit, pushing farther inland than any other Allied force on D-Day. To their west, the British 50th Infantry advanced from Gold, linking steadily with the Canadians on Juno. At the same time, Commandos and the 3rd Infantry Division secured Sword and pushed toward Pegasus Bridge, joining with airborne troops who had held through the night. This growing line gave the Allies a continuous foothold across nearly 50 miles of coast. Yet even as the sectors began to merge, cracks remained, and German forces sought to exploit them. For the Allies, securing the beachhead was a race against German counterattack. And that race was only just beginning. The most immediate threat came from German armor, particularly the 21st Panzer Division, stationed near Caen. Unlike the static divisions manning the Atlantic Wall, these were mobile troops equipped with tanks, artillery, and mechanized infantry. By mid-afternoon on June 6th, elements of the division launched counterattacks against the British near Sword Beach. Columns of panzers rumbled forward, their tracks grinding through the bocage as they probed toward the coast. For a moment, it seemed they might drive a wedge between Sword and Juno, splitting the eastern flank of the invasion. British anti-tank guns barked defiantly, while infantry scrambled to hold the line with Piat launchers and grenades. Naval guns offshore opened fire, shells screaming over the beaches to smash German formations. Fighter bombers streaked in, strafing and bombing tanks caught in the open fields. The attack pressed hard, reaching almost to the coast at Lyon-sur-Mer, but under the combined weight of air, sea, and ground fire, the panzers were forced back. Elsewhere, German counterattacks were piecemeal, a reflection of their fractured command structure. Rommel, away in Germany, could not take immediate control, while Hitler refused to release armored reserves without his personal approval. This paralysis left frontline commanders improvising with limited resources, unable to mount the decisive blows they envisioned. At Omaha, scattered German units launched desperate assaults against the thin American lodgment, only to be shredded by naval fire and infantry holding the bluffs. At Juno and Gold, local counterattacks struck villages and crossroads, but each was repelled by coordinated infantry and tanks. Communications were disrupted by Allied bombing, making it impossible for German divisions to concentrate. The result was a series of sharp but uncoordinated clashes that drained strength without changing the outcome. For Allied troops, the pressure was constant but never overwhelming, and for Germany, every failed thrust wasted time they could never recover. The beachhead was holding. Naval gunfire proved decisive in breaking German attacks and stabilizing the beachheads. Destroyers sailed dangerously close to shore, firing point-blank at German positions hidden in hedgerows and villages. Their guns blasted apart, counter-attacking columns, turning tanks into burning wrecks and infantry into shattered lines. Battleships and cruisers added their weight, hurling shells inland to demolish strong points and disrupt reserves. For infantry on the ground, the sight of massive shells screaming overhead was both terrifying and reassuring. They knew the Navy's guns were their lifeline, capable of smashing threats they could not face alone. Coordination was achieved through radio spotters, who braved frontline fire to direct naval salvos with deadly accuracy. German soldiers later admitted their terror of the ships, calling them land artillery that could never be silenced. Without the Navy, the beachheads might have been swallowed by counterattack. With it, the Allies turned fragile footholds into unbreakable anchors. By June 7th, the separate invasion beaches had begun to merge into a continuous line. Utah was firmly linked with Omaha, creating a unified American front on the Cotentin Peninsula. Gold, Juno, and Sword had joined to form a solid British and Canadian corridor on the eastern flank. Supply lines flowed more smoothly, reinforcements arrived steadily, and artillery could now be concentrated across the sectors. Engineers expanded beach exits, building roads and clearing wreckage to allow tanks and trucks inland. Air superiority ensured that German reinforcements struggled to reach the front, harassed at every turn by bombing and strafing runs. The danger had not passed, but the critical first phase was complete. The Allies now held a continuous beachhead nearly 60 miles wide. The invasion could no longer be undone by a single counterattack, and the door to France was now truly open. The fight to secure the beachhead was less dramatic than the storming of the beaches, but no less decisive. It was fought by engineers clearing roads, by infantry patrolling hedgerows, by tank crews dueling in farm fields, and by sailors firing naval guns with unrelenting accuracy. It was a struggle of cohesion, transforming scattered lodgements into a single living front. For the Germans, every hour of delay and confusion brought their defeat closer. For the Allies, every mile gained and every beach linked meant the invasion was no longer a gamble, but a growing certainty. The men who survived June 6th now dug in, exhausted yet determined, knowing that greater battles awaited inland. Caen, Carentan, and Cherbourg still loomed ahead, each promising new trials, but the beaches were secure, and that was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The Atlantic wall had cracked, and no counterattack could seal it again. The beachhead was secured, and with it the future of Europe began to change. Caen, the ancient Norman city on the Orne River, had been marked as a D-Day objective for the British 3rd Infantry Division. Montgomery's plan envisioned its capture within the first 24 hours, a swift blow that would secure road networks vital for moving deeper into France. But the German High Command also recognized Caen's importance, and they were determined to hold it at any cost. The 21st Panzer Division, already committed near Sword, was reinforced by the 12th SS Panzer Hitler Jugend and Panzer Lehr divisions in the days that followed. These were not static defenders in bunkers, they were elite armoured troops trained for mobile warfare. The bocage terrain around the city funneled the British advance into narrow lanes, perfect killing grounds for German tanks and artillery. Each field, each hedgerow became a fortress defended with fanatical resistance. Caen itself loomed ahead, its medieval spires and stone buildings promising a fight of a different kind, urban combat in streets too narrow for maneuver. And thus began a battle that would drag on for weeks, far beyond Montgomery's optimistic schedule. The first assaults on Caen met fierce opposition in the villages north of the city. At Labisi and Périez, German infantry and tanks counterattacked with ferocity, halting British advances. The 3rd Infantry Division, supported by armour, fought through hedgerows where every hedgerow concealed a machine gun nest or an anti-tank gun. The 21st Panzer Division, fought with tactical skill, launching ambushes that destroyed columns of Shermans. British units clawed forward with artillery support, but progress was measured in yards rather than miles. By June 7th, it was clear that Caen would not fall quickly. The Germans had transformed it into a bastion anchoring the eastern flank of their defense. Montgomery responded by shifting his strategy. Rather than take Caen in a rush, he would use it to fix German armor in place. The British and Canadians would bear the weight of these divisions, while the Americans pushed west toward Cherbourg and Brittany. It was a calculated gamble, one that drew criticism from allies and commanders alike, but it set the stage for weeks of grinding, attritional warfare. As days turned into weeks, the struggle for Caen became one of the bloodiest battles of Normandy. The British launched Operation Perch in mid-June, attempting a pincer movement around the city. Armoured columns advanced toward Villers-Bocage, only to be halted by the ferocious counterattacks of Michael Whitman and his Tiger tank unit. In a single morning, Whitman's Tigers destroyed an entire squadron of Shermans and Cromwells, halting the British thrust cold. The defeat forced the Allies to reconsider their tactics, relying more heavily on overwhelming artillery barrages. Canadian forces to the north attacked villages like Buron and Orphy, encountering fanatical resistance from the 12th SS Panzer Division, composed largely of Hitler Youth. The fighting was savage, marked by close-quarters combat and atrocities committed against captured prisoners. Every gain was paid for in blood, every advance answered with a counterattack. The dream of a quick capture had vanished, replaced by a grim war of attrition. And still, Caen stood defiant amid smoke and rubble. The Allies turned increasingly to air power and heavy bombing raids to break the German grip on Caen. In early July, Operation Charnwood unleashed one of the heaviest air assaults of the campaign. Hundreds of bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives on the northern half of the city. The effect was devastating. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, flames rising into the night sky as civilians and soldiers alike were buried under the ruins. For British and Canadian infantry advancing behind the bombardment, the destruction was both a curse and a blessing. German positions had been disrupted, but the rubble clogged streets, turning them into impassable barricades. Civilians trapped in their homes suffered terribly, paying the price of liberation in fire and blood. Soldiers moved cautiously through ruins filled with snipers, mines, and machine guns. The devastation of Caen became emblematic of modern war, victory purchased at the cost of a city destroyed. And yet, even after Charnwood, only half of Caen lay in Allied hands. Montgomery's persistence led to Operation Goodwood, a massive armoured thrust designed to smash through German defences east of Caen. On July 18th, more than 1,000 bombers softened the battlefield, their bombs carpeting the German lines. Then over 1,200 British tanks rolled forward across open ground, one of the largest armoured assaults of the war. At first, the advance gained ground quickly, crushing outposts and scattering infantry. But the German defences stiffened, and the narrow battlefield funneled the tanks into kill zones. Anti-tank guns, dug into camouflaged positions, ripped through the British armour with deadly precision. Tiger and Panther tanks counterattacked, engaging in duels that set the fields ablaze with burning steel. By the end of the day, hundreds of British tanks lay destroyed or disabled, their wrecks littering the plain. Goodwood had gained ground, but failed to achieve the breakthrough Montgomery promised. Critics condemned the operation as wasteful, but Montgomery insisted it had tied down German armour, and in that he was correct. For Canadian forces, the struggle was no less brutal. Operations Atlantic and Totalize sought to seize the southern half of Calden and break through to Falaise. Canadian infantry advanced through villages reduced to rubble, facing machine gun nests hidden among smoking ruins. They fought through the Abbaye d'Ardennes, where captured prisoners had been massacred by the 12th SS earlier in June. Canadian tank crews, often outgunned by German Panthers and Tigers, fought with grit and determination, trading machines for ground. Night attacks using searchlights to illuminate the battlefield brought eerie, surreal scenes of combat. Casualties mounted, yet progress continued, and slowly the noose around Calden tightened. By mid-July, Canadian and British forces had finally secured the city, though at terrible cost to soldiers and civilians alike. The capture of Calden opened the way for the next phase of the campaign, the breakout into the French countryside. But the price paid for the city was etched into every ruined street. Calden had fallen, but at a cost far beyond what had been imagined on D-Day. Montgomery's tactics during the battle for Caen became a subject of controversy both during and after the war. Critics accused him of timidity, of failing to seize opportunities for bold breakthroughs. They pointed to the high casualties and the slow pace of operations, comparing his methods unfavorably to Patton's rapid drive in the West. Yet defenders argued that Montgomery's strategy achieved its purpose. It pinned the German panzer divisions in the east, preventing them from striking at the American sector. By forcing the Germans to commit their best armor to Caen, Montgomery ensured that the U.S. First Army could break out through weaker opposition in Operation Cobra. The British and Canadians bore the brunt of the German armored fury, suffering heavily but keeping the Germans fixed. For soldiers on the ground, the debate meant little. Their reality was hedgerows, rubble, and death. But for history, the question of Montgomery's intentions remains one of the great controversies of Normandy, and Caen became the symbol of both his caution and his endurance. When the dust finally settled, Caen was a city transformed into ruins. Its medieval churches stood shattered, its homes reduced to rubble, its streets choked with debris. Tens of thousands of civilians had been killed or displaced, their lives torn apart in the crossfire of liberation. For the Allies, the capture of Caen was both a triumph and a tragedy. A key objective secured, but at a staggering cost, soldiers remembered it as a place of unrelenting combat, where every corner concealed death. Civilians remembered it as the day their city was destroyed to be freed. Strategically, Caen anchored the Allied line in Normandy, opening the door to the breakout that would follow. Emotionally, it stood as a testament to sacrifice, endurance, and the devastation of modern war. Caen had fallen, but in its ashes lay the foundation of Allied victory in France, and its ruins whispered the price of liberation. By late July 1944, nearly 2 months after D-Day, the Allies were still trapped in the deadly maze of Normandy's hedgerows. These ancient earthen embankments, topped with thick brush and trees, turned every field into a fortress. American infantry had to crawl forward yard by yard, clearing German defenders who used the bocage like natural fortifications. Tanks could not maneuver easily, their guns unable to depress enough to hit enemies hidden in the ditches. German machine guns and mortars inflicted heavy casualties, stalling the advance at a pace that frustrated commanders and exhausted soldiers. Patton, Bradley, and Eisenhower knew the stalemate had to be broken before the Allies bled themselves dry. The plan was Operation Cobra, a concentrated offensive aimed at tearing open the German line west of St. Lo. It would rely on overwhelming air power and artillery to smash the enemy before unleashing armored columns into the gap. The stakes were immense, either a breakthrough or another grinding attritional struggle, and the men in the fields knew the outcome would define the campaign in France. The centerpiece of Operation Cobra was the massive use of strategic and tactical bombing. More than 3,000 Allied aircraft, including B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, were tasked with saturating the German positions. Their target was a narrow strip of front, about 4 miles wide, where the 2nd SS Panzer Division and other German units had dug in. The idea was simple but brutal: obliterate the defenses, shatter morale, and open the door for American tanks to surge through. In the days before the offensive, troops on the ground watched the skies fill with aircraft, their contrails stretching across the horizon like silver lines of destiny. The bombardment began on July 25th, a thunderstorm of explosives that shook the earth and left craters as wide as houses. Columns of smoke rose thousands of feet, blotting out the sun and filling the air with choking dust. German defenders were pulverized, many killed before they could fire a shot. But the bombing was imprecise, and some American units were hit by friendly fire, suffering hundreds of casualties. It was the terrible cost of unleashing such overwhelming firepower in a confined battlefield. When the bombardment lifted, American infantry surged forward into the shattered German lines. The 9th and 30th Infantry Divisions advanced through smoke and wreckage, their rifles and bayonets ready. Many defenders were too stunned to resist, their positions destroyed or their units cut to pieces. Others fought bitterly from craters and ruins, forcing the Americans into deadly close combat. Engineers worked to clear paths through rubble and wrecked vehicles, often under sniper fire. Tanks rumbled forward behind them, using hedgerows as cover while firing on scattered strongpoints. Resistance crumbled in patches, but in others the Germans held with fanatic determination. The advance was uneven at first, but momentum steadily built as gaps widened in the enemy's line. Commanders urged their men onward, knowing speed was essential to exploit the breakthrough. Operation Cobra was underway, and the door to open country had begun to crack. The key to Cobra's success was the commitment of American armor, unleashed once the infantry had pried open the gap. Columns of Sherman tanks from the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions poured through, supported by self-propelled artillery and motorized infantry. Dust and smoke filled the sky as engines roared, the columns stretching for miles along the Norman lanes. For weeks, tanks had been confined to narrow fields and villages, choked by hedgerows and ambushes. Now, with the German line fractured, they surged into open ground, finally able to maneuver at speed. German defenders, already battered, struggled to mount organized resistance against the sudden torrent of steel. Isolated units fought valiantly, but they were bypassed or destroyed by overwhelming force. The speed of the advance stunned the Germans, who had expected attrition but not breakthrough. For the Americans, it was the liberation of movement after weeks of bloody stalemate, and for Normandy, it was the beginning of collapse. German commanders recognized the threat immediately, but their ability to respond was crippled. Hitler had forbidden tactical withdrawals, ordering units to hold ground at all costs. The result was disaster, as divisions were trapped in positions obliterated by artillery and airstrikes. Tanks and vehicles tried to maneuver under cover, but Allied fighter bombers prowled the skies, destroying anything that moved in daylight. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons became the terror of German columns, their rockets and machine guns shredding convoys. Soldiers on the ground described the roads littered with burning wreckage, the air thick with smoke and screams. German armor, so feared in earlier campaigns, now found itself outmatched and overwhelmed. Commanders like von Kluge begged for permission to retreat, but Hitler's orders chained them to their doom. The weight of Allied air power and armor crushed resistance, and the German front began to unravel. What had begun as a narrow breach was turning into a tidal wave. By July 27th, Cobra had achieved its decisive breakthrough, American forces surged past St. Lo, fanning out into the open plains of western Normandy. The 4th Armored Division advanced rapidly, capturing towns and crossroads before German reinforcements could react. Infantry followed close behind, securing flanks and mopping up bypassed strong points. German divisions, trapped and battered, retreated in disarray, leaving equipment and dead in their wake. Entire formations dissolved under the pressure, their cohesion shattered by weeks of attrition and days of relentless bombardment. The momentum was unstoppable, and the Americans pressed forward without pause. In days they had advanced farther than in the previous 6 weeks combined. The breakout had come, sudden and overwhelming, like a dam bursting after relentless pressure. Normandy was no longer a cage, it was the gateway to liberation. The breakout transformed the Allied campaign overnight. With German forces fixed around Caen by British and Canadian offensives, the American push widened into a flood. Patton's Third Army, unleashed in early August, drove south and west with breathtaking speed. His armored columns cut through Brittany, seized key ports, and turned east toward the Seine. The Germans, unable to regroup, faced encirclement in what became the Falaise Pocket. Cobra had not only broken the stalemate, it had opened the road to the heart of France. French civilians watched in awe as columns of Shermans and half-tracks thundered through their villages, liberators arriving in clouds of dust. Resistance fighters rose from hiding to guide Allied units and harass retreating Germans. The contrast with the grinding attrition of June was stark. Now the Allies were on the move, and the Germans were in retreat. Cobra had shifted the balance of the war in Normandy, and with it the liberation of France became inevitable. Operation Cobra was the turning point of the Normandy campaign, the moment the Allies shattered the stalemate and seized the initiative. It had been achieved through planning, sacrifice, and above all, the overwhelming power of Allied air superiority. The cost was real. American units suffered friendly fire casualties and the chaos of fighting through hedgerows. But the result was decisive, a breakout that ended German hopes of containing the invasion. From Cobra came the rapid advance across France, the liberation of Paris, and the collapse of German power in the West. Soldiers who had crawled through hedgerows now rode in tanks across open fields, their spirits lifted by the momentum of victory. Civilians who had endured years of occupation now greeted their liberators with flowers, flags, and tears. The struggle of Normandy was not over, but its outcome had been sealed. Cobra had opened the gates, and through them the Allies marched toward freedom. Operation Overlord was more than the largest amphibious invasion in history. It was the decisive turning point in the struggle for Europe. On June 6, 1944, the Allies opened the long-promised Western Front, forcing Germany to fight on 3 massive fronts at once, in France, in Italy, and against the relentless Soviet tide in the east. The Wehrmacht, already stretched thin, now faced the impossible task of defending a crumbling empire against enemies who could replace men and machines faster than Germany ever could. In the weeks after D-Day, German losses mounted at an unsustainable pace, eroding the backbone of their once formidable army. Hitler's gamble on the Atlantic Wall had failed, and the illusion of invincibility was shattered before the eyes of the world. For the Allies, Normandy was not just a foothold, it was a declaration that liberation was unstoppable. The beachheads became bridges, the bridges became highways, and from Normandy, Allied armies poured into France. Every mile advanced after June 6 traced back to the gamble taken on that stormy morning, and with that gamble, the tide of war shifted irreversibly. Strategically, Overlord secured the future of the war, in ways that rippled far beyond Normandy. The Western Allies gained the ability to mass forces on continental soil, turning logistical preparation into relentless offensives. Ports were opened, airfields established, and rail lines repaired, enabling supplies to surge across the Channel in a torrent unmatched by any other campaign. The Soviet Union, long bearing the brunt of Germany's fury, now saw its Western allies fulfill their promise to relieve pressure. Stalin had demanded a second front for years, and Overlord finally delivered it in spectacular fashion. German divisions that might have fought in Russia were pinned down in France, their armor burning in the hedgerows instead of in the fields of Ukraine. The coordination of Britain, America, and Canada in Overlord became a blueprint for coalition warfare, blending strengths while absorbing losses together. The Wehrmacht's strategic freedom was gone, its reserves drained on every side, and from that loss came the inevitability of Germany's defeat. Normandy was not the end of the war, but it ensured that the end was coming. Yet victory was never free, and the human cost of Overlord remains its most haunting legacy. On D-Day alone, more than 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, their bodies lying in the surf, on the sand, and in the fields of Normandy. Thousands more Germans perished, defending the coast, many buried where they fell in shattered bunkers and trenches. French civilians suffered terribly, caught between liberation and destruction, their homes leveled in bombing raids and artillery barrages. Entire villages were reduced to rubble, their inhabitants left to sift through ashes, where lives had once unfolded in peace. Farmers returned to fields filled with wreckage, bodies, and unexploded shells, their land scarred by war for generations. For survivors, the memories of June 6th were etched forever. The sights, the sounds, the fear, the comrades who never rose again. The cost was measured not only in numbers, but in grief that crossed oceans and continents. Behind every statistic lay a family, a story, and a silence that could never be filled, and it is in that silence that D-Day speaks most loudly. The medics, engineers, and chaplains of D-Day embodied sacrifice in its purest form, often without recognition. Medics crawled through fire to save the wounded, their armbands no protection against bullets or shells. Engineers detonated obstacles by hand, clearing the way for others while exposing themselves to certain death. Chaplains whispered prayers amid the storm, offering solace to dying men whose final moments were softened by words of faith. These figures did not storm bunkers or hold machine guns, yet their courage was no less vital. They fought the battle not with weapons but with compassion, ingenuity, and selflessness. Their legacy is woven into the larger story of Overlord, reminders that victory depends on more than firepower. For those who lived because of their efforts, gratitude lasted a lifetime. For those who died in their arms, their presence meant they did not die alone, and in their service, the humanity of D-Day was preserved amid its cruelty. The remembrance of Overlord extends beyond the battlefield, into the way nations understood their unity and purpose. The invasion was the product of cooperation on a scale the world had never seen before. British, American, Canadian, Free French, Polish, and countless others fighting side by side. Their ships sailed together, their aircraft flew in formation, and their soldiers bled on the same beaches. This unity was not merely military, it was political, cultural, and moral, forged in the belief that tyranny had to be defeated. The planning rooms in London, the training fields in England, the factories in America, and the resistance networks in France all contributed to the same moment. D-Day proved that democracies could coordinate vast resources, wield immense power, and still preserve the principles they fought for. It was the triumph of cooperation over division, of persistence over despair. and that triumph echoed beyond Normandy into the post-war world. Overlord became not just a military operation, but a symbol of what unity could achieve. For the men who fought, the memory of D-Day was deeply personal, often too heavy to share. Veterans spoke of comradeship forged in fire, of the bond between men who faced death together and carried each other through. They recalled the sights that never left them. The surf littered with bodies, the sky filled with bombers, the hedgerows alive with gunfire. Some returned to Normandy in later years, walking among the rows of white crosses that marked the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer. Others stood silently in the villages they had liberated, welcomed by children and grandchildren of those who had witnessed their arrival. The emotional toll of D-Day was immense, shaping lives long after the war was over. Many carried the weight of guilt, remembering those who had not survived. Yet they also carried pride, knowing they had been part of history's most daring gamble. For them, Overlord was not a chapter in a textbook. It was the defining moment of their lives, and its echoes followed them until their last breath. Today, D-Day stands as one of the most enduring symbols of courage and sacrifice in modern history. The beaches of Normandy, once soaked in blood, are now places of pilgrimage and remembrance. Monuments rise above the cliffs, museums preserve the stories, and cemeteries keep silent watch over the fallen. Each June 6th, veterans, families, and leaders gather to honor the memory of those who stormed the beaches. They speak of freedom, of the price paid, and of the unity that made victory possible. The world remembers D-Day not only as a military triumph, but as a moral one, a moment when humanity stood against tyranny and prevailed. Its symbolism transcends borders, reminding nations of what can be achieved when courage and cooperation meet. The memory of D-Day belongs not only to those who fought, but to all who live in the freedom they secured. It is both a warning and an inspiration, and it ensures that the legacy of Overlord endures for generations to come. Operation Overlord was more than a campaign. It was the hinge upon which the fate of the 20th century turned. Its success guaranteed the liberation of Western Europe, hastened the collapse of Nazi Germany, and reshaped the post-war world. The human cost was immense, the suffering profound, but the victory undeniable. For those who lived through it, the memory remains etched in silence, in tears and in the gratitude of free nations. For history, it stands as proof that freedom, though costly, is worth the sacrifice. Overlord was the moment when planning met courage, when strategy met sacrifice, and when ordinary men achieved the extraordinary. It turned the tide of the war, but more than that, it turned the tide of history itself. The beaches of Normandy will forever echo with the voices of those who gave everything, and in their echo lies the promise of remembrance, courage, and liberation. That is the legacy of D-Day.